Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is the Storage Workshop, Storage Resources Providing Celery Services. My name is Brenda Corona, here with the Stakeholder Affairs Group at the California ISO. Today, I'm joined by a few folks for today's workshop, Gabe Murtaugh, Guillermo Ardante, and Bill Weaver. So today, we will be hosting this workshop and going over logistics on the next few slides of how to participate during the workshop as well. As a reminder, this call is being recorded for information and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Although this call is structured to stimulate open dialogue and engage diverse perspectives, we will have opportunities for multiple people to ask questions, and so please feel free to use the raise hand icon during the duration of this meeting. In order for us to call on you, please make sure you state your name and affiliation clearly so we can know who's speaking. As well, please refrain from repeating or reiterating something that was already previously said so that way we could move on to a different topic. If you also are joined through audio only, you will have to use #2 to join. Feel free to send us let us know through the audio if you're having any issues. We will be able to monitor that as well. And then if you have any questions, send them through the panelists, to all panelists, or myself or Keone, who will be helping me on the second half of this meeting. For today's agenda, we will go over two major topics. The first one will be for data storage providing ancillary services with Guillermo, and then we will move on to potential solutions for storage providing ancillary services with Gabe. And then we will have a moment to go over discussion questions on those two topics prior to moving on to Alva's presentation from PG&E, and then we will do another roundtable discussion after that. We hope to end around noon, but if anything, we will encourage you to ask questions and then review any questions that we may have during the call. For today's timeline, it reflects closely similar to what we had in August 25th, where we are currently at this proposal development phase of posting the draft final proposal. At this time, we had comments submitted on September last week on Friday, so those comments have been received. They will be approved shortly today and be visible to everyone at the Policy Initiatives webpage for energy storage. But the next step will follow our final proposal as well as other decisional items that we will be highlighting during the next step. So make sure you stay for that. But other than that, we will go ahead and move on to our next topic. And I do see Alva on our test audio. We will go ahead and test audio with you, Alva, in a very short moment. We are aware of that. But other than that, we will go ahead with Gabe and open up the next topic.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. I appreciate it. That was a nice introduction. I would just add, this is certainly a formal part of our stakeholder process, but I think it's a little less formal than a typical presentation that the ISO is giving on a policy proposal. Today, it really is a workshop. I wanted to set this up to foster dialogue between the ISO and the stakeholders who are providing comments in the Energy Storage Enhancements initiative. We are not going to be talking about the whole initiative today. We're only focusing on the aspects of the Energy Storage Enhancements policy that relate to ancillary services. One of the things that I think we've heard, for a little while now is, we've been expressing these ideas about concerns around storage resources that are providing ancillary services in our market, and we haven't presented on, we've presented on a few cases where there have been instances where resources have not been able to provide the ancillary services that they've been awarded, but we haven't really presented holistic information on how storage resources are performing in regards to providing AS in totality. Today, we're at least dipping our toe in the water. Guillermo has done a considerable amount of analysis, and I think he's ready to present the highest level results that he's come up with so far. I think he's still digging into some of the analysis on particular instances for particular resources. But I think what we're presenting here today really does a nice job of covering the gamut of what we've seen over the last, I think it's something like 6 months, what storage resources have been doing, what some of the pain points are. Like I said, it's certainly not going to go into every last bit of detail on every case we've seen, and we have seen quite a few cases, and I think that's part of the other side of the story that we want to bring up is that this isn't these aren't isolated incidents. It's not necessarily isolated resources. It is happening. Concerns about providing ancillary services from the storage community are popping up across a number of different resources in a number of different ways. So Guillermo's going to get into that today. I also want this to be a little bit less formal than a typical meeting, and I do want to get some more dialogue going. I understand that storage operators and scheduling coordinators who are relying on storage to provide AS are interested in these resources being able to provide the service, but they're also, and the ISO is obviously interested in making sure that when these resources sign up and say they are going to be providing ancillary services, that they're there and available and that they can actually provide and actually are providing the services that they're signed up to provide. And I think coming up with, the next iteration of rules around this, particularly around the lithium-ion batteries that we have on the system right now, is going to be important. And, the ISO doesn't want to do this hastily or irrationally, but we want to think through what's going to work and what rules make sense and what can keep these resources providing AS on our system. To that end, I think we've, like Brenda said, we have allotted quite a bit of time at the end of the conversation to just kind of have this dialogue. If people have other ideas, I think I'm certainly interested in hearing those ideas, and we can spend a little bit of time talking, and I invite everyone to speak up and just kind of put your opinion in about where we are and where we might like to go in this policy. The other thing I would like to say, and we've talked quite a bit about this, but storage resources obviously are a relatively new technology on the grid. The market model is still evolving. We've all been parts of the conversation where we're talking about the storage modeling enhancements initiative, which we will be working on as soon as we can get this initiative wrapped up, or a little bit closer to being wrapped up, and devote some more time to it. But we're going to be iterating on the model of storage resources, and then we're also going to be likely iterating on these kinds of rules around AS. If there are better rules, we don't have to necessarily stay with the rules that we have in place. As our market and our understanding of how this technology works grows and evolves, if there's better rules that we can use and implement or improvements that we can make to our model that would better facilitate these resources providing AS, we're happy to talk about that. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more initiatives and policy development work in the storage area as we go forward. So this is, I just kind of want to put that out there. This is an evolving conversation. I don't think this is the final word, but we do need to think hard about what tools we need, and our operators are certainly advocating for tools right now to be able to help storage resources provide ancillary services when they're awarded them. Okay, let's go ahead on to the first slide. And I'm just setting the stage here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Guillermo, and he's going to walk through some of the analysis that he's done. So the ISO, and hopefully this isn't a surprise to anybody, has identified two potential areas of concern for storage resources providing AS. I think when you see the data from Guillermo, it might, one of the things that might pop out is, oh, there might be other things that are underlying this data. We know that there could be other issues out there. And I think our communication and dialogue that we've had internally, between the policy team, the operations team, the data analysis team, the legal team, we think that these are the two highest priority issues that we can take care of in this initiative. Like I said, we also think that there's some other modeling enhancements that are going to help with some of these problems, but these are the two that we want to focus on right now. With that said, what we have been thinking about and what we've been talking about in the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative are this first issue of state of charge. And we obviously have a model where we're thinking about how we can utilize storage resources best, and we include state of charge in that model. And state of charge can change based on energy awards and dispatches. And if those awards are made in the day-ahead market and they materialize in the real-time market, we tend to see pretty close tracking between day-ahead and real-time state of charge. But we also see cases where, storage resource is awarded ancillary services in the day-ahead market that doesn't impact state of charge in the formulation today, and that can cause very different outcomes in terms of state of charge in the real-time market when the resource is actually providing these services. So the bottom line here is that, we've kind of flagged that the formula that governs state of charge does not account for changes related to the use of regulation. They probably should. This could help us better align that estimate of what we think state of charge is going to be in the day-ahead market to what it could actually be in reality in the real-time market. And the very simple example is if a storage resource is providing regulation and it's not providing anything else and it's providing reg up, obviously over time the state of charge of that resource will decrease. Opposite is true if the resource is providing regulation down, it's not providing anything else. Over time, the state of charge for that resource will increase. We know this is the case, but we're not including this in our day-ahead model, and I think the point here is we probably should be. Second item is that if a resource has a fully depleted state of charge, it can't provide ancillary services. Like I said, Guillermo has some data on this. I don't think the data that Guillermo is providing today is necessarily, the final line in the sand of all the data that we're going to provide, and it doesn't necessarily go into every situation where a storage resource is depleted with state of charge. But I think from a theoretical point of view, this certainly could happen. And what we have suggested to kind of deal with that is some new bidding rules and include some requirements for energy bids alongside the ancillary service awards in our markets. And I'll talk a little bit about that after Guillermo gets done with his presentation. So, and I think the bottom line here is that, there are cases where some storage resources are becoming completely depleted while they're providing ancillary services. Then once that happens, our operators can't provide or can't rely on those resources to provide those ancillary services. So it puts them in a bind. They're in a situation where, it's difficult to get more resources to provide ancillary services sometimes, and they're trying not to do that if they can avoid it. So that's sort of a recap of what we've talked about at the absolute highest level in the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative. So with that, I do want to, I can take a pause here and ask for questions, but then I'm going to turn it over to Guillermo and have him kick off the discussion on some of the data analysis that he's been doing, and some of the information that he's got here is pretty interesting. So Brenda, any comments on the phone right now?
Susan Schneider, your line is open.
Yeah. Hi, Gabe. Good morning. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Thanks first of all, thanks for having this workshop. I think this is something that representing LSA that we really have asked for, and in terms of additional data. So I really appreciate you getting that together and looking forward to hearing it. I did have just a quick question about, it seems like you're really focused on regulation here, and in particular, regulation up. But when you're talking about depletion, I think it go the other way too, also on regulation down, right? I mean, if they're providing that then they could be basically too full, right, to provide that. Are you seeing that as well?
Yes.
Okay. And then are you going to be looking also at operating reserve? Have you seen that as an issue? It seems like it would be sort of a similar thing, but we haven't really talked about it. So I
Yeah.
just wonder if you're looking at that as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think this would be, a similar thing. It is probably something that's worth looking at. Frankly, we just haven't, we thought that regulation was probably the bigger, more important piece to bite off to start with, and then maybe we start to think about the other services, spin, non-spin, later. I am involved in policy development in the price formation initiative. I think there's a chance there we might be looking at the stated charge formulation because of imbalance reserves. And if we open that discussion up to thinking about changes to the stated charge formulation, we might also include looking at spin and non-spin there too.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like there's been at least some publicity in the media about the fact that the storage, I mean, in terms of the price formation, that the storage, some of the storage had discharged in the afternoon and before the evening in some of the more recent heat events, and that caused some problem in the evening. So that would be more in the price formation initiative, you think?
Yeah, I think we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the price formation initiative, yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for those comments, Susan. Appreciate it. Anybody else in the queue, Brenda?
No one in the queue.
Okay, great. I will pass the virtual mic over to Guillermo then.
Thank you, Dave. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this. Let me give you some preamble because obviously analytics is a quite a key component of the policy initiative that we are undertaking, provides the evidence, the guidance of where the issues may be. And we try to put some of the material that could be useful for this discussion. Obviously, we have very limited time given the time of the year we are dealing with right now. This is, I would say, partial analysis we have done. It's not a full comprehensive analysis that we would like to have. There are many layers you can start peeling the onion to go deeper and deeper. So we really focus on the big items. And this is not the end of the analysis. I think based on the discussions, we naturally will continue to converge into the specific areas of interest. I always consider that this type of analysis is naturally, inherently a very organic process. When you reach certain level, you realize some other areas that you have to look, and that is just the natural progression of this type of analytics. And given the time, given the scope, this is as much as we could put together for this session, and hopefully it's going to be a good catalyst to spark the discussion and help us to point into more specific areas. Let me start with the very first item, and then we will go into more of the background and details. There are different areas how you can start approaching this problem and try to analyze what's going on. This first illustration tries to capture the bigger picture of what we have been dealing with when it comes to regulation provided by storage resources. Let me try to unpack a little bit how we compose this illustration. There are two different trends, one in bars, one in lines. The portion in bars is going to have different groups. And the count that you have for these bars is kind of strange. It's the total count of all resources for all the potential intervals impacted. So if you may have 3 resources and each one was impacted by one 15-minute interval, that would be a count of 3. If you have 2 resources impacted by one interval and one third resource impacted 10 intervals, that would be a total of 12. So it's the total summation of intervals / resources. And we organized this by every calendar month. We have done this for the first month of 2022. And the groups are relatively generic. We try to consolidate this in a very few meaningful groups. There may be some outliers, some undefined cases, but this hopefully gives you the bigger picture. Now, on the right-hand side, we have the total count of events. This is just a specific event regardless of how many intervals and how many resources this may have impacted. Effectively, this is an event where the operators saw something not working properly in the system, may have seen some resources deviating, it may have seen some congestion in the system. There was an event that induced an operator action. So regardless of how many resources, for how long that was in place, we count that as one single event. So I want to give you the two flavors so that you can get a sense of the magnitude, the extent, and the frequency of these conditions. And if we start with the number of events on the right-hand side, you can see that it varies. The highest is around 37, 38 events, and that happened just in August. That effectively means during the month of August, there were 35 times in which the operators have to take active action to basically do something regarding the regulation from storage resources. Typically, that may require that the operators block the resource from continuing to receive regulation because it may not be providing the regulation, they may not set themselves on the AGC, they may not following closely the instruction. So the operators effectively see a problem and they have to intervene to try to mitigate for that problem. If we compare, for instance, July versus August, you can see that the count is quite dramatic, right? It's anywhere between 6 in July to about 37, 38 in August. And it's quite volatile because it depends on all the system conditions that we are dealing with at that point on time. Now, on the left-hand side, when we account for the bars, the count of resources and intervals, you have here all this breakdown. And the group that we consolidated has to do with the general terms in which operators may have to take action. One of them, and it's not applicable just to storage resources, it may happen also to other type of non-storage resources. For instance, congestion. We may have procured or we know that there is congestion that may be getting the AES stranded behind the constraint. They know that the capacity is not going to be able to be deployed if needed. Therefore, they basically buy back that capacity because congestion makes that capacity non-deliverable. There is another instruction, another group, that is the failed bad telemetry, and that is when there were issues. And typically, when the telemetry comes bad, the market is going to behave bad, right? Because typically the telemetry is the starting point for the market to do the math. The telemetry based on the state of charge, the telemetry based on the actual production is always going to be taken in the real time as the starting point to determine where the unit should be now and how we can project the unit to be dispatched in the next 5, 15, 20, 30 minutes. So it's critical that that information, that telemetry is of good quality. And when the quality is not there, obviously it's going to have material implications of what the market is going to be doing in dispatching that resource properly. There is another group that we identify as the unit not on AGC. Once the resource gets awarded energy or AES, and if they get regulation awards, one of the processes is that once you reach that time frame, the resource has to get on AGC. Effectively, it has to be enabled to follow the set points. But for that, they have to be on AGC first. For whatever reasons, we have seen that there are cases in which the units are simply not on AGC. It could be as easy as put it in auto mode so that when the regulation comes, they get on AGC. Sometimes it may be set manually. There will be a lot of scenarios that we can unwrap here to try to understand what's going on behind those cases. But at the end of the day, the unit is not on AGC, and if so, it consequently cannot follow the set point of the regulation. The other group is the unit not following instruction. The unit got awarded regulation, is on AGC, but for whatever reason is not following this instruction. And there is another group that could be somehow overlapping to some extent in some cases with the unit not following the instruction, and that is the group in purple. That refers to the state of charge limitation. There are cases in which the operator sees that the unit cannot continue to deploy regulation because it has hit its state of charge limit, either upper or lower, and therefore they have to basically put the unit out of the regulation because it cannot effectively follow the instructions. And in general, these are the main groups. There could be obviously more classifications, more subgrouping. I feel that starting at this level is meaningful to give you a whole picture of potentially what the big issues are. And if now you look at into the specific patterns, it's quite random, and that's somehow expected because you can have many different conditions at different times. Now, keep in mind, these are events that the operators have to actively take action to try to remedy the problem. They may not be able to deal with every single problem all the time. So this wouldn't be a very exhaustive list of conditions that happen or were prevented. And the count also may be tricky to delineate because let's say that a resource has regulation awards from, from 9 to noon. And the operators observe that they are not following the instructions, they are not on AGC, there is a problem. Therefore, starting effectively now, they may prevent the unit to continue to get the regulation. They have to buy back that capacity. Well, even though in the day-ahead market the unit was awarded up to noon, there are chances that even though they don't have anything else for the remainder of the day, for the second part of the day, in the real time when the need comes, these resources may continue to get awards in the real time. So in some cases, the operators may want to hedge against that condition, and the event that they take is not just for the specific hours in which there was a day-ahead award, but also to prevent the real time to continue awarding that unit when they know that there is a problem. So there are many nuances how you can be actually more surgical in terms of counting the resource and the number of intervals. And overall, when we see relative to one to another, where the big issues are, right? Naturally, the ones that are consistent and persistent over time is the ones in green and gray. And this happens to be units not following the instructions or units not on AGC that effectively cannot follow the instructions either. And the other flavors of the reasons that may be here and there. The SOC limitation that is explicitly identified by the operators for these specific instances, you can see here and there to some extent is not that significant relative to the other two reasons. And this is one way to try to put in the largest context the implications and the issues that at the end of the day, we are seeing in the actual operation of the system. This is not about just the market, this is the issues that the operators have to deal with once they are operating the system, because obviously having the regulation awards, once we expect to be able to deploy and utilize that regulation, any deviation from there can really pose a reliability concern to the proper operation of the system. Let me pause just here and take questions that I see coming up. Brenda or operators, can we go through each of those?
Susan, your line is open.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Thank you, Guillermo. This is an extremely interesting chart, and I just have a few questions about it. It does seem like the state of charge limitation, which is what you're focusing on here, logically seems like it would be an issue. But when you look at the chart, it actually looks like there's a lot of other things, and the state of charge seems like a relatively small piece of the problem compared to all of these other things. Is that a correct conclusion to draw from looking at this chart?
Yeah, this is very relative, and let me try to caveat the history, the logic here, because one part is how precise we can be in grouping these two reasons, right? Effectively, we have to go item by item and measure whether it was SOC limitation or unit not following instructions. In some cases, the unit not following this instruction may be precisely because it has hit the SOC limit, even though the operator at that precise point on time couldn't observe that event, and he was just looking that, well, the unit is not following. I don't know yet. I don't have time to figure out why. So I would caveat, it's not black and white delineation. There may be some cases in the green that may be actually part of the purple.
Okay. And then for things like the unit not being on AGC, are you and bad telemetry, is there, I mean, it seems like that would be sort of basic things that you need to test to be even certified for ancillary services. And the telemetry, of course, is a requirement just to be on the system. So I guess are you following up with units afterward to find out, well, why was the unit not on AGC, or what is there follow-up happening with these individual units?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And again, I would like to caveat the grouping here because the way you characterize this, some of those cases may be when things went wrong with the technology, right? We have bad telemetry, something didn't work properly. So you may be talking again cases between the red group and the gray group, between telemetry or technology issues versus the unit effectively not being set on AGC on purpose. We have had very few specific events that we have been trying to follow up with the participant with a plan to try to understand better what are the conditions for this. But as you can see, as long as there are too many cases, I think we have an opportunity still to try to consolidate the reason behind why these units are not on AGC. The technology is there. We have seen units that so precisely can follow the instructions that it's just amazing to see how accurate that could be. So I don't think it's a matter of technology because it's there and it's proving to work for many other units. So we need to really continue to work more with the plants and scaling coordinators to understand what is the challenges that they are running into to have this type of outcomes.
Well, yeah, because just to be certified to be on regulation, you have to show you have AGC and it's functional and you can follow the signal. So if then the unit is not on AGC when you ask them to, would that call into question their certification potentially?
Yeah, I think this is a lot of work that we still have to undertake, Susan.
Okay.
To fully understand.
Okay, and then I just had one question about congestion, which seems like a big deal potentially in the spring where you've got the whole duck belly, phenomenon maybe at its worst. Is this something that could be addressed through? It seems like the ancillary services regions are in some way supposed to address congestion in at least some fashion, or the definition of those. Are you looking at how that might be changed?
Yeah, and I think the regional designation of the provision of AES help. Sometimes the challenges are more local related, and there are very local conditions that they still can put you in the same situation. And I can tell you, I can see that May, right? That one got my attention right away when we started putting these metrics together. What's happening in May, right? And it happened that it was one event, basically for 3 days long, right? And that's all what it takes to bump you up that much. So it was one event, a specific event for 3 consecutive days that gives you that high count.
Okay, and that course is a pretty critical month, in the those shoulder months. So okay, anyway, those are all the questions I have. I don't want to take up the whole time just on this one chart, but yeah, very interesting, and we'll be looking forward to getting updates as you dig deeper into it. But thank you for providing this.
Thank you, Susan.
Sergio, your line is open.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. This is Sergio Dueñas with the California Energy Storage Alliance. I think Susan mostly covered what I wanted to ask. It would just seem that the ISO has been focused a lot on curing what in this chart is represented as the purple part of the bar. And while this chart is handy from your comments, Guillermo, it seems like they introduce another level of uncertainty, that maybe the purple is not just the issue. Maybe part of the green area has to do with the same concern, and it would just seem that this chart sort of gives us a bit more questions than it answers then, because it doesn't really tell us the magnitude of the SOC problem. So I would try to, I've gone through the presentation. I know that you've taken some of the stakeholder feedback on the proposals, but through the rest of the conversation, it will be interesting to see just how adequate that 50% piece of the proposal is, considering the data. Given that we cannot determine, based on this chart, the magnitude or how important the SOC limitation is on failing to get regulation, since there's multiple causes of failing to get regulation. Um, Maybe later we can understand better about that 50%. But Susan basically covered everything else I wanted to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Cesar. Let me just provide a comment on this because uh, as you may see through the presentation, we're trying to approach this from different angles. This specific angle is not the only angle that we need to look at. This is the angle from the operational point of view, right? This is what operators are seeing as a problem when operating the system, and that is when they are required to take some action to mitigate for that. Now, the other angle that you are going to see through the rest of the presentation is more driven from the data, regardless of what operators did, that in some cases may mute the issue because they are effectively trying to mitigate for the issue. So we cannot analyze what happened right after because they already addressed the issue manually. But for the other cases where there was no specific operator or action, we can still rely on the data to try to understand the relationship, the impacts. And this is where I believe we are just scratching the surface of the problem. There are many deeper levels we can go to try to understand and try to quantify more scientifically the impact, the extent of the issue that has to do with the SOC.
So actually, now that you cover that, could I do a quick follow-up on what you said? So what are the differences in consequences from these different categories of potential reasons for failing to provide regulation? Because I would imagine that red and gray are somewhat different in the eyes of the ISO than the green area. Could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with that part of the compliance. I will have to go back to check internally with our other teams. And what I can tell you, settlement-wise, I believe there wouldn't be much difference because any deviation is basically settled in the same way. It doesn't distinguish by these color codes. In terms of the actual compliance implications, this is something I have to defer. I'm not equipped to elaborate on that right now.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Next caller, operator.
Hey, Guillermo. Callie Wells with WPTF. Hey,
hi,
so hi. I had a very similar observation as Susan as well. When we look at this chart, the SOC seems relatively small compared to everything else, so I won't repeat that part of the conversation. But I do have an additional thought. I know later on in your slides, you talk about the buyback through the market. So do you think possibly part of the issue we're talking about in the policy paper in terms of these resources maybe not having sufficient state of charge is actually shown in that chart because the market is picking it up in the 15-minute market and it's actually being bought back through the market and not because of an operator action?
Yeah. Would you mind to hold a little bit the question because I would like to expand on that and I have a specific slide to cover that. So I believe I will be able to respond on that in very good detail later down the presentation.
Okay, I appreciate that. So really the SOC limitation here is just operator actions identifying that after the market has already run, whereas it could also be addressed through the market prior to operators having to take action.
Let me just caveat a little bit
Okay.
because yes, for when the operators are going to take action is because they already saw something happen, right? And that means the regulation was already awarded. They may already know that they are not being performing, they are not following, they are not getting the regulation that they need. So they already know that, look in the back mirror, there was a problem. The reason why they are trying to intervene now is to mitigate for that problem. So moving forward, they don't have to deal with that, and the market is not going to deal with that problem. So one consequence of the operator's action is to effectively force the buyback of those resources to no longer continue to provide regulation, because if they haven't provided for the last 3-5 hours, what chances are that they are not going to do the same for the remainder of the day, right? So once they took the action, effectively they are forcing the buyback of that procurement. So I think timing is important just to differentiate the before and after.
Okay, I appreciate it. I'll wait till you get to that slide and see if I have any other follow-up questions. I'm just, yeah, in my mind, I'm thinking maybe you said it's kind of, this is one slice of it, one perspective. So I think maybe with the SOC limitation issue, it might be a combination of the two different perspectives. So, all right, thank you. I'll wait till that slide.
Thank you.
Eleanor, your line's open.
Hi, Guillermo. Hi, Gabe. Appreciate this additional dialogue related to storage. And, my question is really just related to the categories here, just so we can clarify a little bit so that I can understand the next few slides that you guys have. The unit not following instruction versus the unit not on AGC, you've segregated this to say that on the unit not following instruction, CAISO took control of the unit, but it wasn't following the 4-second set point. Is that correct? And then the unit.
Basically.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, you're right. Please go ahead.
And then the unit not on AGC, I'm assuming that it is different from the failed and bad telemetry because it doesn't really have the unit not on AGC is actually that there is an outage card associated to AGC not being available, or for some reason there is a regulation award and CAISO could not take control of the unit whatsoever, and therefore it's not following the instruction. That's why I just wanted to delineate the two things a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to repeat myself because I really want to caveat this, right? It's not a black and white delineation because one may have consequences for the other. If the unit is not on AGC,
that's right.
The natural consequence is that it cannot follow the instruction, right? So
exactly.
You put stretch it and put it in the green if you prefer, but that would mute a little bit the reason, the driver. So what we try to do here is to try to differentiate between the unit is on control, is able to follow the set point, but for whatever reason is not following the instruction, versus the other that is more basic that, well, the unit got regulation, but we were not able to take control of the unit for whatever reason. So, and therefore the second level of consequence is that it's not going to be able to follow the instruction. And on top of that, there may be some cases that at that time, and I think this is important to put in the right dimension because when the operators are working, they are just going by just in time, right? They don't have the time to investigate, if there is a bad telemetry or if there is a technology issue. They just see that, well, the unit for whatever reason cannot be on control. But some of those cases eventually may happen to be that, now I know that yesterday we have the same issue and now we learn that the unit is having bad telemetry, right? So now you may put that case into the other group of bad telemetry or some technology issue. So that is the reason I have to caveat this. It's very relative and it's just at the face value of what we know of what happened for these cases without going into the specific analysis to try to understand every single nuance of every single case.
Right, understood. And, one thing to just comment on, I know when I've been trying to commercialize one of the first units of Calpine for storage, is that from the technology perspective, I've always been told there's like two types of modes that the storage would do. One is in remote and one is on manual. But I don't think that control is actually telemetered or a required telemetry by CAISO. So it might be something that the CAISO would look into to say that, hey, if I'm taking control and I'm on AGC and the unit is actually not on remote, then technically I can't take control of the unit, and therefore it's going to be a problem. So that, there is an assessment from CAISO that, this particular unit cannot provide regulation. But that's just something that maybe you guys should consider as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Eleanor. These are very good points.
Thanks so much, Guillermo.
Okay, I don't see anybody else on the list. So let's move on. The next slide, please. And let me switch a little bit of topic. We're going to go back and forth through 2-3 different areas. This second one is related to the interaction that happens between procurement of regulation, the projection that we have in the day-ahead market, how it actually materializes in the real time. And this is going back to one of the opening remarks that Gabe was pointing out. So let me explain the dynamic here. The first one is you have a trend in blue that is the state of charge for the integrated forward market. And you can see that based on the day-ahead projection, based on the day-ahead conditions, this state of charge remains basically flat for most of the day, and it just has a dip in the later part of the day. But effectively, the state of charge remains flat. The starting point is a little bit under 400 megawatt hour and remains that. This resource effectively is only providing or participating for regulation. It's not participating for, or it doesn't get awarded any energy, and therefore that is the reason the state of charge remains flat. Because right now, under the current construct, the procurement of the regulation in the day-ahead market is not considered to define what the state of charge is going to be. Now, the trend in green is the actual state of charge once we are operating that resource in the real time. And you can see it has a specific trend. It goes up and down between the hour, given the changing conditions that we have. Given the fact that these resources mostly providing regulation, you can see that the meaningful pattern change observed through the day is precisely because of the utilization of the state of charge for providing regulation. And it could be in either way. It can be charging or discharging because that specific resource was with both regulation up and regulation down. Effectively, through the end of the day, you have all this accumulation of energy that was utilized, that was depleted, that was brought into the state of charge, that the day-ahead market, once it was projecting how to dispatch that unit, couldn't see. Obviously, it's before the fact. But if you compare the blue line with the green line, that is day-ahead versus real time, you can see how much they can diverge, simply by the fact that once you start deploying that regulation, it's going to be utilized in a state of charge. If we were to put a counterfactual, and let's say we start with the very original starting point of the state of charge in the first hour of the day-ahead market, and somehow you have this crystal ball to know how much the regulation is going to be depleted or utilized for the rest of the day, the next day, and we put that back, what you are going to get is that just for accounting for that depletion, that utilization of the regulation, you move from the blue line towards the gray line. That would be specifically the state of charge profile once you precisely, in hindsight, account for the utilization of the resource for regulation. Obviously, and this is in hindsight and Monday quarterback because we know after the fact how the utilization was. The challenge is what do we do when we have to clear the day-ahead market, knowing that if the resource is on regulation, very likely it's going to be utilized for depletion of regulation. So we know the state of charge is going to be somewhere else rather than just a flat line. And I think this is the area that Gabe has been discussing with you all over the initiative of how we can more reasonably account for that state of charge change through the day, knowing that they will be used, they will be depleted, and they are going to influence the state of charge. And this is just a very graphical illustration to highlight how far apart the real time can be from the day ahead. And obviously, that may also pose some problems because if the day ahead is procuring that regulation and based on this optimistic view of a flat line for the state of charge, and now in the real time they start reaching certain level of state of charge, we may run into the other problem that we are starting to discuss, that at some point they may reach the level of the state of charge where they can no longer procure the regulation. And now it's a hindsight because now it has to be cured to the real time. The market may have to buy back, the operator may have to block it. So it's the consequences that it creates by the fact that the day ahead was overly optimistic when releasing and awarding that resource for regulation. I don't see any questions. Let me make sure that we don't have any pending questions before we move now into the more details. This is just the big view. Let me now go deeper into the specifics.
Guillermo, we did get a question in chat. Maybe you were able to see it
Maybe.
from Ying Hong Ji.
Okay, yeah. Okay, what caused the congestion? Is that some forced transmission distribution outage one-time event? I don't have the specifics, and we could eventually find out what the specific constraint was causing this problem. At this point, I don't know. I recall it was a 3-day lapse issue when that happened in May. And the second question, is this not getting regulating from storage, meaning the storage already got regulation and was not able to perform accordingly? Yes. And I think these are the 2 questions. Okay. Now I also see a couple of hands raised. Brenda, can we go through them?
Yeah. Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. This seems to illustrate a situation where, the deviation is very interesting, but it seems to illustrate a situation where the state of charge toward the end of the day, after, or even in the middle of the day is higher than what was assumed in the day ahead market. But the concern seems to be a little bit more weighted, at least from the verbiage, seems to be a little more weighted toward where the state of charge is depleted. But here it seems to be higher. So, am I understanding this properly?
Yeah, and I wouldn't generalize this illustration to capture the whole dimension of the challenge, right? Okay. I think the overarching concern is that the day ahead may be key enough from a very optimistic view that eventually may not be realized in the real time, and that may pose another problems and collateral implications. In this specific case, you are right, the state of charge is going to be higher than projected, but higher or lower could may have implications for either regulation down or regulation up, depending on what side of the equation you are. So the high or the low, it could be equally problematic depending on what service the unit is providing.
Okay, so in this case, the day-ahead market was actually pessimistic, depending on whether they were getting regulation up or regulation down awards. So, okay, all right. I just want to make sure I'm understanding it properly. So, thank you for the clarification.
You're welcome. Okay, we have more.
Callie Wells.
Yes.
Sorry, Callie Wells with WPTF again. They unmuted my line, so I assume it's my turn.
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is really interesting, and I want to make sure I understand this chart, specifically the adjusted IFM line. So is that essentially, if you look back and apply that multiplier we're talking about in the policy to the IFM state of charge, you would get the gray line?
No, it's slightly different. This is if you have perfect forecast of what happened. So effectively, what we are doing is measuring all the signals of the regulation, how much the resource follow the regulation, how much energy it charge or discharge by following that regulation signal, and we do that in 4 seconds. So we basically, you calculate all the energy underneath the signal to estimate how much energy was associated with following that signal, whether it's charging or discharging. And for each hour of the day, we were basically putting back that energy utilized to define what the new state of charge would be for that hour. And that becomes the new starting point for the subsequent hour. So it's a cumulative accounting of the energy that was utilized for regulation in the real time. It's a perfect foresee of what was utilized in the real time, because obviously we have the luxury to know now what happened after the fact.
Okay, that makes sense. And so ideally, the gray and the green line would be identical, and it looks like there's a relatively consistent difference between the two. Do you know what's driving that?
Yes, we know. It happens that this unit, there are 2 points. The first one is that right from the start, they start in different places, right? The state of charge, the starting condition of the state of charge for the day ahead is higher than where effectively the unit starts in the real time. That is going to give you right up front divergence. Now, that divergence grows and remains basically constant because it happens that this unit in particular got energy awards, I believe, in our ending 2 and 3. And because now it procures energy, it's going to change the state of charge that is going to remain with that gap for the rest of the day. So it was energy dispatch in the very beginning of the day that makes that gap to be wider. And then there was another energy award somewhere late in the day that makes have created an extra difference. And actually, in the original version of this plot, we have another line that was the counterfactual. Once you take into account the perfect accounting of also the energy, right? And you can see that that counterfactual line becomes very, very close to this green real-time line. So in this case, we wanted to isolate just the effect of the regulation. But anytime there is also a difference of procurement between the day ahead and the real time for energy, that is going to either converge or diverge more that separation between the day ahead and the real time.
Okay, that helps. So when you mentioned that it didn't have any energy awarded that was specific to day ahead, in real time it actually did get some energy scheduled in addition to the regulation.
Correct.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on now. Can we change the slide, please? Let me start now from the beginning. I want to give you the alert spoiler first. And we have a few trends because I think it's important to keep the perspective why we're having this talk. And the bottom line is that storage resources with all these fascinating capabilities and characteristics that can be very greatly utilized for the system, the capacity is growing. And as you start having more and more capacity, the type of challenges could become more significant. And as you can see, you just look at for the first 8 months of 2022, we have seen a very explosive growth of storage resources. And that's a good thing. This additional capacity that is coming is simply the consequences that we have to tune our market design, that we have to deal with the potential collateral implications of having that much capacity into the system. This one just gives you a sense of the trending of the state of charge, just to give you a size of the growth of the resources. And you can see it's an increasing trend, a very nice increasing trend. And that is made available across the market, starting from the IFM, the integrated forward market, the ROC process, and the real time. Next slide, please. This one is also a specific delineation of the procurement that we get for these resources for each of the different types of ancillary services. We have spin, non-spin, regulation up, and regulation down. This is historically how the procurement has been for the storage resources. And you can see that the majority, the largest volume of the capacity utilized from storage resources goes effectively into the regulation down, followed by regulation up. And that is one of the reasons we are focusing so much in the regulation aspect, because it's meaningful. And I don't know if you have seen, for instance, other metrics that we put, I don't know, maybe a couple of cycles of the Market Performance Forum meeting when we specifically analyzed deeper the implications of the AES market. And at some point, I think it was somewhere November 2021, when we saw for the first time that the regulation market was fully saturated by storage resources. Effectively, they have enough capacity to be able to meet by themselves all the requirements needed for regulation. So once you start reaching that point, it's quite important to ensure that we have all things lined up to get and leverage that capacity available in the market. Next slide, please. This is just a typical profile, an hourly profile of where and how much we are procuring for the regulation. In this case, it's regulation down, and the focus in this case is the integrated forward market. Typically, we aim at meeting 100% of our requirements right there from the day-ahead market. We still have an opportunity, a last opportunity to procure incremental AES in the real-time market, up to the 15-minute market only, when things change. But we typically start very solid from the day-ahead market, and that is the reason it's a very natural reference to see how much we are procuring right from the day-ahead market. And you can see that there is some type of trend. Obviously, the volumes increase in the middle of the day when we have typically plenty of production from renewable resources, where we may have the need to handle uncertainty, variability that is typical in the middle of the day, mainly in the shoulder months, I would say. But it types following some kind of trend here. If we go to the next slide, please. This is the trend in the same way constructed for the Regulation Act. Still is the integrated forward market, and you can see that the procurement really concentrates more on the peak hours. And that is where we're going to have the Regulation App available. And in some months, surprisingly, like in June, you can see very little in comparison to other months. But overall, I would say you can see the highest levels of regulation being procured around the peak time of the day. Next slide, please. And this just puts all together. It's a simple average. Averages are not good to give you a very precise picture, but relatively speaking can give you a sense of the relative size of one product versus the other. And you can see the regulation down usually the one that takes the majority of the volume for storage resources, followed by regulation up, and a little bit of the spinning capacity. With that, I hope you can see the perspective. The procurement of the regulation, or in general, the AES market is basically quite important because it provides all these reliability products for the system. And with increasing level of storage resource penetration, they are naturally becoming the providers of these critical reliability services of regulation up, regulation down, to some extent spin. And that is so critical why we need to ensure that we have the right design, the right structure in place for properly utilizing the capabilities that these incredible technologies can give us. Next slide, please. Okay, let me switch gears because now I would like to go back to the beginning of the discussion, and this is trying to unpack a little bit. As I indicated, the very first slide that we spent some time was from the perspective of what operators are facing, what they have to do, what they observe, and try to mitigate for those conditions. Now, we are taking a different approach. Now we're taking just the data analytics approach, regardless of what operators did, what eventually transpired in the market, how that worked for storage resources. And here we have a concept that is quite typical. It's not related to storage resources. This concept is actually related to procurement of ancillary services. And this is the concept of buyback. Typically, we refer to buyback when you have a position from the day-ahead market. And it's not, actually, it's a very generic concept that you can apply to energy as well, right? You have a position that you got from the day-ahead market. You get awarded regulation in the day-ahead market for X amounts of megawatts. Now we come into the real time. You can participate in the real-time market. You can make capacity available to clear more. You can, in some cases like energy, put an economical bid to try to buy back that position if the price is right, and that is allowed within the rules that we have. For regulation, it's slightly different because once we procure the regulation from the day-ahead market, we expect that it's just going to carry over to the real time. We're going to protect it. We're going to treat it like qualified capacity. There may be changing conditions. There may be operator actions in which that capacity procured from the day-ahead market eventually cannot be utilized in the real time. So our resource got 100 megawatts of regulation in the day-ahead market. Something happened that now when we have to clear the last opportunity for AES in the 15-minute market, that 100 megawatts cannot be procured. Now the resource is going to be dispatched anywhere between 100 up to 0. If that procurement reduced from 100 to 80 megawatts, is being put in this group in gray that is partial buyback. It's still procuring some amount, but not the full day-ahead award. The ones in blue is the complete extreme, when you have a procurement from the day ahead completely bought back into the real time. You got 100 in the day ahead, you get 0 into the real time. And typically, this could be driven by either operators' actions or by the market dynamic, and there are different reasons why that may happen. This is still coming back to Kelly's question that I want to address. But before that, let me move into the next one, because this is broken down by regulation down, and we also have the similar metric for regulation up. Next slide, please. And you can see it's like a heart attack, right? It's kind of random values going up and down. And there is no specific trend, but the only thing that you can get out of this is that it's persistent. It's not just a one-time event that happens sporadically. It's happening quite frequently, and the magnitude can be also significant. It's not just noise to consider that it's not material. Given that, and we try to unpack this a little bit more. So next slide, please. Now, in order to come with these system-level metrics, we have to start from the resource-specific metric and to start measuring resource by resource, how much they got in the day ahead, how much they get into the real time. And that is how we identify whether it's a full or partial buyback. And the metrics that you have here in this slide is these two matrices, one for regulation up, one for regulation down. And we explicitly put the percentage of the time in which a storage resource bought back the procurement of the day-ahead market. And this is a relative percentage. It's not considering every single interval of the market. It's only considering the interval in which there was a day-ahead award. So, for instance, if we have that one resource got awarded for 2 hours in the day-ahead market for regulation, that would make 8 intervals in the 15-minute market. When we go and see how much of that was bought back into the real time, and if we see that for 1 hour or 4 intervals of these 2 hours, the resource bought back the capacity is going to show like 50%, because in 4 intervals out of the 8, the capacity from the day-ahead market was bought back. So it's relative to the intervals in which it has an award from the day-ahead market. And we go from the highest frequency to the lowest frequency. We stop at resource number 25. There may be 15, 20 more resources down that are aggregated as other. This just gives you a sense, right? How pervasive, how spread this issue is across the different resources. And you can see it's not just 1, 2 resources. It's quite spread across at least the top 25 resources. And the time of the year is also meaningful. You can see that it's not only a matter of one specific month. It's consistent over every single month. In some months you have higher values, and you can see that in the darker blue. The highest I could see, for instance, is about 66% of regulation up for the month of May for resource number 14. But please keep in mind, it's a relative percentage against the intervals in which it was awarded the service. In a different way, we can try to see now, operationally speaking, this is important because it matters also how systemic this is along the day, right? If we move to the next slide, please. This is just the regulation down as an illustration, and this is broken out by hourly granularity. We want to see when in the day this may be more problematic or is more persistent. And it's a very nice matrix, because you can see that many of the percentages are concentrated in the middle of the day. And that is typically when we have the procurement of regulation down. That is when it's reaching the highest levels of regulation. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you procure that much, potentially it is what you are going to have more of the challenges. There may be some cases, surprisingly, for some resources where the issue is more pronounced in the late hours of the day. And you can see that with the dark blue. That is as high as 57% in hour ending 21 for resource number 12. So this is just to give you some sense how persistent, how consistent that the challenge is. The previous slides give you a sense of the size, the magnitude. Obviously, averages is not always a good way to measure this, but at least gives you a big picture of how meaningful this could be. Next slide, please. I think there is one question from Eleanor. Let me just finish this slide and then we can take questions, please. So now trying to answer Kelly's questions and cover this material. As I indicated, we are taking now the approach different to what the first slide was. That is just the events observed by the operators. In this case, we are taking this data approach. Whatever is in the data, we want to understand what is happening. And in this case, we don't distinguish whether it is by operator actions or by the market. But in general, the buyback can happen because of either of two reasons. One is because the operator is taking action because it saw a problem, the unit is not following, the unit is not on AGC, the unit reached the maximum SOC, and therefore it knows that it cannot get the regulation that is expected that was awarded. So it's taking effective action, and it can force the resource to buy back, say, okay, this resource is not delivering, it's not following, we are going to buy back that capacity so that we can release that capacity, and somebody else in the market can pick that capacity because we still need to meet our requirements for regulation. So this is completely driven by the operators, given any conditions that he may observe happening right now in the real time. It could be congestion, it could be resource deviation, it could be a technology issue, whatever. It's an action taken by operators to force the buyback. And that is going to be measured in the data because we are going to be comparing day ahead versus real time regardless. The second part is a bit more convoluted because it may not be driven by the operator. The operator may have not taken any action. But once we are running the real-time market, the market takes into account all the resource characteristics, all the conditions that we have, all the requirements that we may have. It finds that for whatever reason, it cannot meet the expectation to hold the procurement from the day-ahead market. We explored a few cases of this partial buyback, and we have found that, well, something changed. From the day ahead into the real time, we know things are going to change. That is the inherent dynamic of the system. And in some cases, it could be as simple as now the resource has a delay. And because it has a delay, it can no longer accommodate the full capacity that was awarded in the day ahead. And now the market has to buy back that capacity on that resource and make it available to be procured from other resources. It could be the case that now the constraint for reaching the state of charge is hitting, and now the resource is not going to be able to meet that regulation. So the market has to do something to try to realign to the actual condition. And there may be many other flavors and changing conditions that effectively and eventually lead to the real-time market to buy back and reprocure the AES because something is not working ideally for that specific resource. And I think in general, that would be the explanation of the buyback, whether it's full or partial. I can tell you again that there may be cases in which the buyback was full, from the full capacity up to zero, and not necessarily driven by the operator. It may have been by the market determining that was the optimal solution. So we are not at this point defining whether it's driven by the operator or not. Now, anytime the operators force the buyback, is going to show up in this data, but we are not slicing that information in this way so far. With that, I expect to have answered Kelly's question, and we can go with Eleanor and hear more questions if needed. Operators, I think we can open the line for Eleanor.
Hey, thank you, Eleanor Reyes at Calpine. Guillermo, the presentation on, I think it was page, what's that, 17 and 18, where the hourly buyback of regulation was presented. Was there any, I don't know if you've reviewed this, but is there any correlation between the initial condition or the initial state of charge in the day ahead versus the actual state of charge that may have caused that to where it couldn't catch up?
Yeah. I think it's a very possible area of analysis, Eleanor. We just didn't have time to do many permutations of this analysis. I don't mean that this is final, but this is as much as we could put together for this time. But I'm noting down that to see later on we can take on that.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Kelly, I would like to hear from you if you are okay with the answer or you have any follow-up based on your earlier question.
Hi, Guillermo, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. No, I think your explanation answered all my questions, so I really appreciate you walking us through that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, let's move on then to the next slide, please. This is a follow-up or unpacking a little bit information of the second slide that we started the presentation with. This is just to give you some additional information. And what you have here is the historical amount of state of charge associated with the deployment of regulation in the real-time market. This tells you the delta that potentially are not being looked in the day-ahead market when we have this optimistic view that you just stay with a flat state of charge. This is as much as energy that the state of charge is not accounting when making the projection for the day-ahead market. And we have many other methods, but I want just to give you a sense that if you look at, for instance, 3 months, that is originally what the information gave was relying on in the previous rounds, you can see that it's persistent as well. It's not just an isolated event. You can see that it happens potentially for every hour and solid for 3 months, right? And we can put more metrics as needed for the near future. Next slide, please. Okay, let me cover now the last topic, and this goes back to the deviations. Somehow it's related to the item that we discussed originally about, for whatever reason, the resource get awarded regulation up or regulation down. The resource may or may not be put on AGC. The resource may or may not follow the instruction. Regardless, every time the market awarded regulation to the resource, we have the expectation that eventually they are going to be able to follow the instructions, regardless of any of these flavors as to why it couldn't. State of charge, not on AGC, or simply deviating. What we have done is trying to do this more systematically, analyze this more systematically. We have done this for the first 8 months of the year. We have done that for regulation up, for regulation down, and you can see that there are variations, and these are variations that happen every single month in either direction. And again, this is just highlighting that it's not an isolated event. It's consistent, persistent over time. Next slide, please. And this is a breakdown of the regulation up and regulation down by a specific month. The previous one was just all month together for all hours. This gives you the visibility by hour of each month. And still, you can see that it's persistent through all the hours of the day, through every month of the year so far. And just to reinforce that this is not an isolated event. Next slide, please. Now, let me start with this. I myself, personally, I am fascinated to see the capabilities of these technologies. Storage resources have such precision, such an accuracy that is just amazing to see how they perform in the real life system. And this is a picture of a resource that got energy awards that are in blue, and it got a very few awards in our ending 8, our ending 19, and our ending 20. This is just energy. This resource also got regulation awards, and the regulation awards were basically for all day long. So effectively, that resource was on regulation for the whole day. And what typically, how we operate the system, effectively you have an energy award that is based on the energy dispatching, on the energy instructions that we send you. If on top of that, the resource gets regulation awarded, we expect that around that dispatch operating target, the resource is going to have this band of operation, right, to follow the instruction up or down. And that is really the AGC signal. So the DOT, the dispatch operating target, becomes the reference for every time how far the unit can go up or down. If the unit receives a signal that is above that dispatch operating target, it's asking to provide regulation. If it is below, it's asking to provide regulation down. And obviously for the storage, it can be charged or discharged, so there may be analogous in the charging side. But the expectation is that once the system puts that resource on AGC, meaning it's able to follow the instruction, now should follow the instruction. We are going to be sending this set point, and I believe it's every 4 seconds. So every 4 seconds we signal what the AGC set point is, and the resource is expected to follow and match that level. Well, that signal is what we show here with dotted line in black. That is the AGC point. And you may not see that clearly because it happens to be basically behind the line in green. And the line in green is the actual, exactly what the resource did. So having the dotted line behind the green line is simply telling us that this resource is precisely following the signal, right? It's a perfect performance. It's precisely following exactly what the system is asking the resource to do. This shows the capabilities are there. The resources are able to follow so precisely the instructions of the AGC signal. And this is great to have in the system because they can react so fast and so precisely that the value is there. And this is a very good case to see that the batteries can really provide that service to the system and do it in such a precise way. Next slide, please. Now, let me take a slightly different side of the equation. When we analyze this, and we did that for every single resource, for every minute basically of operation of the system, for every single interval in which the resource has awards for regulation, and we did that for these 8 months. So we have plenty of data. And having that much data becomes sometimes problematic how to try to unravel the dynamics of the system. So given the timing to put this together, we were able to only do one level of analysis, and that is to try to find any relationship, any correlation between the units deviating, not following this instruction, versus where they were in the state of charge. Different units are going to have different capacities, different levels of capacity. So in order to try to make this uniform, we translated the state of charge as a percentage. It's the minimum, the maximum, and anywhere in between to give you a relative sense of the state of charge. Every dot is a sample that we have for that resource. This specific variation of the metric accounts for all the deviations that we have for 8 months of that resource, all together, all hours. And either regulation up or regulation down. It's everything together for that resource. And there is a line in addition to the dots, and that line is a vivid, bright blue line. In this case, it looks like a horizontal flat line. This is a simple regression line that we want to put just to try to measure any correlation data-wise that this may have between the SOC and the deviation. And that line basically is flat, and basically because you have the extremes pulling in different ways, and you have positive and negative values for each end of the spectrum. The shaded areas just highlight the portions of the state of charge where we can claim that the unit is getting close to the critical point of the state of charge where they cannot continue to charge or discharge to be able to follow the signal. From my understanding, it doesn't have to be precisely at the Pmax or the Pmin of the state of charge. They may start running into that complication a little bit earlier before reaching that level of saturation. And these are somehow relative. We just put the 80% plus and minus at each end of the spectrum of the state of charge. And graphically, you can see that there are a lot of points and that are not around the zero. And many of those points are not small. These are not just around the zero value. Indeed, the metric that we have here, we filter any value that is smaller than 0.1 megawatt or 1%, just to take out the noise, right, and try to follow more meaningful deviations. And interesting enough, this is one of the top resources, meaning this is the one of the resources that have the highest frequency of deviations, interval-wise. And if you look at the ends of the spectrum of the state of charge, you can see that, yeah, there is some pattern here. You can see that there are more deviations at the ends. They tend to be greater than the ones that are in the middle, but it's not conclusive. This is just illustration to try to grasp really at the system level what is happening for this resource. And the fact that the regression line is kind of flat is just because these opposite extremes are pushing each other. Depending on the resources, you may have different trends that we can observe. And for this same resource, let me move to the next slide, please, so you can see if we break down this a little bit more granular, how that looks for every single month. And we have this by the total deviation or organized by regulation up or regulation down. And here you have the trend. You can see that somehow it's persistent. Some months are more pronounced than others. That's expected, but the trend is there. There are deviations, and some of those are quite meaningful. The next slide, please, is going to show just the aggregation. If we just go by the count, by the histogram, where the deviations are happening. And this is just not the magnitude, but the frequency of the deviations. And you can see that two bars stand up, right? Stand out of the whole range. And they tend to be when they are getting closer to the ends of the state of charge range. Can that be conclusive that it's a problem only when they are close to the state of charge? No. But we're saying that there is a higher frequency of points, deviations that align with this end of the state of charge. Doing this consistently over the whole period of time may be challenged. I think naturally something that we need to start doing is being more surgical, trying to identify specific cases, try to match these versus the cases that we know from the operator's actions to try to unravel and understand why these deviations are happening. That's really all the material we were able to put together for today. In the appendix, we have added 4 more resources. Effectively, that gives you the top 5 resources in terms of the frequency of deviations. So you can get a sense of how it varies from resource to resource, at least for the top 5 resources. And this is all what we have for today in terms of the analytics, and I would be happy to see if there are any pending questions before sending back to Gabe.
There are no questions in the queue. Oh, sorry, someone did just raise their hand.
Hi, Guillermo, this is Alvis Svoboda. I was just wondering in terms of the, or just something to look at, is there any evidence in looking at these deviations at the upper and lower ends of the SOC range that this corresponds to the kind of ramp rate issues that have been brought up in the past by some of the battery operators as being what constrains the accuracy of the resource in those ranges? Or does it just seem they just simply become less accurate at those in those ranges? I'm not saying you can answer it now, but I think that would be a good thing to look at.
Yeah, I think that would be something that we can continue to look at that, Albert. Right now, we don't have more information on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Gabe, back to you.
Oh, let's see if I can get this going here. Okay, thank you, Guillermo. That was really great. You know, I really do appreciate you spending the time, first of all, to put these graphics together. I think they're really illustrative. And then second, taking all the time to go through them. And I know we haven't heard the last on this, and we'll continue to iterate as we get more data and can dive deeper into it. And hopefully that informs some of the policy discussions. So if we advance, I think 2 slides, that's the one, yeah. So we talked a little bit about the problems that we had initially illustrated in the proposal, and then we've also talked a little bit about the solutions. And I don't want to dwell on this too long because I know we've talked a lot about it in the regular policy meetings. But I did just want to go through at a very high level where we were, just so everybody's on the same page. The 2 proposals we had to the 2 problems that were posited earlier are, first of all, update the state of charge equation so that it reflects regulation awards. Essentially, we would make an estimate of what would happen to state of charge as that resource receives awards for energy or potentially for regulation, and that'd be regulation up or regulation down. One of the pieces of feedback we got last time we chatted was potentially using different hourly multipliers. So don't use the same multiplier for hour ending 1 as hour ending 5 as hour ending 15, because likely you will be using more energy if you're providing reg up, say, during some of those hours than others. So keep that in mind. Number 2 is this requirement that we've been talking about to provide bids alongside ancillary service awards. We would be ensuring, the idea here is that if a resource was completely depleted, there would be some energy bids that the resource would be providing to the ISO, and via those energy bids, the ISO could potentially dispatch the resource to either charge or discharge if needed, so that it could have sufficient state of charge to continue providing ancillary services in the real-time market. And I think some of the feedback we got on that rule is that the ISO may want to consider, tailoring these requirements to specific hours. Just like I said, with the regulation awards, sometimes they impact state of charge more during more hours, meaning the resource has to have more state of charge during some hours than others. This might be something we might be able to apply to these bidding rules as well. And then I think the other ask was to think hard about whether or not these requirements needed to be applied in both the day ahead and the real-time markets. In the last proposal, we proposed both tools. Part of the reason we're having this workshop today is talk about where stakeholders are in this process, getting some of that feedback, and then having this dialogue about, where we may need to take the policy to in order to, address the questions that Guillermo's talking about with his data analysis, and making sure the solutions we're putting in place are going to address those problems. Okay, next slide, please. Again, not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. This is the outline of the state of charge formulation. The top equation is the state of charge formulation the way it is listed and calculated today. The second equation is the state of charge formulation that we are proposing. Obviously, we're adding the reg up and the reg down terms, and there's going to be a multiplier appended to the beginning of those terms. What does that multiplier look like? We've included this information in the appendix, and that's on the next slide. You can tell that these values really vary wildly throughout the day. So if you just look at that first column, or the second column rather, reg up really changes a lot. So kind of in the peak hours, hour ending 17, hour ending 18, 16% of whatever your award is for the hour is likely on average, during a typical hour ending 16, hour ending 17, likely to be converted into actual energy, and that would be energy depleted from a resource that's providing reg up, whereas at the end of hour ending 2 or ending 3, a resource that's providing reg up, only about 2% of that award gets converted into energy lost for the resource. So for example, if you have a resource that receives a 100 megawatt award for regulation up in hour ending 2, a typical resource only depletes state of charge by about 2 megawatt hours while providing that regulating service for the full hour. Hour ending 17 that would be closer to 16 megawatts typically. Obviously, those are ballpark average numbers. It could be a little higher, they could be a little lower. For reg down, the numbers are quite a bit larger during some of the hours, particularly in the late afternoon. You're looking at the 20 to even 30, mid-30s% range. Earlier in the day, it might be 10, in the 10 to 15% range. Hour ending 7, hour ending 8 are a little bit higher at 22 and 24%. Next slide, please. So the other proposal that we had talked about was requiring energy bids alongside ancillary service awards. Again, this was a lengthy discussion that we've had with operators, likely coming out of a lot of those cases that Guillermo had pointed out where we said, hey, during this month, we had a heck of a lot of intervals where we had to go in and do something manually to storage resources because, for a variety of different reasons, they weren't able to provide the ancillary services that they were signed up to provide in the day-ahead market, which got transferred to the real-time schedules. What we had initially proposed was to require storage resources to have matching bids to whatever their ancillary service award was during any particular hour in the opposite direction. So if you're a resource, you get a 100 megawatt award for regulation up, you'd have to have a 100 megawatt bid for energy in the opposite direction. We reduced that requirement to 50%. So that same 100 megawatt regulation award would require 50 megawatts to be bid in the reg down direction. And we did note that this requirement could limit or would effectively limit the amount of ancillary services that storage resources could potentially qualify for. Today, you could, for a storage resource, could potentially get a reg up award all the way up to your PMAX, a reg down award all the way down to your PMIN, and that would be something that could be awarded today. In the future, with this rule in place, it wouldn't necessarily be, you wouldn't be able to get that award. The proposal, and the whole point of this is that we would reduce some of those buybacks and reduce some of that manual intervention that the operators would have to do and are performing today in the real-time market. Okay. I think I have, one more slide. These are the examples, and they're largely the same examples that we walked through in our last meeting. I think I've expanded them a little bit and talking a little bit about the difference between the day-ahead market awards and the real-time market awards. Essentially, if you are a plus or minus 12 megawatt resource and a 48 megawatt hour resource, so you've got a 4-hour duration, then if the resource was being awarded regulation in the day-ahead market, sort of the maximum, obviously, award you could be awarded for regulation up would still be 12 megawatts, which is the same as what it is today, as long as you're not getting a reg down award for a full 12 megawatts. If you're just getting an award for regulation down, it would be, again, the maximum of 12 megawatts. If you were getting equal sized awards in both the reg up and the reg down direction, you could get an award for up to 8 megawatts of regulation up at the same hour as an award of 8 megawatts of regulation down. And I think we had talked about having a bidding requirement in the day-ahead market in the last version of the written paper. I think, on hearing stakeholder feedback and reflecting on it, we don't necessarily have to have that, and I don't think we would need a bidding requirement in the day-ahead market. But in real time, as these resources are actually providing these services, so for example, 12 megawatts of reg in either direction, you'd have to have 6 megawatts of energy awarded in the opposite direction. And then if the resource was awarded, for example, 8 megawatts of reg up at the same hour as 8 megawatts of reg down, all 4 remaining megawatts of capacity in the charging direction and the discharging direction would be required to be bid in as energy with what we had proposed in the last version of the paper. And I know we had talked about some changes to make, and I want to kind of get into that discussion in a little bit. So I'll pause here. If anybody has any questions on sort of what we've proposed to date, that's what I'd like to take right now. After this, I'd like to give Alva a chance to present because he's put together some slides. And then I think I'd like to sort of bring the conversation back around and say, well, given what we've talked about today, what do we think are appropriate rules to set, if these aren't the appropriate rules to set, and then go from there. So I did see, and let me see if I can pull this up. It's a little bit hard to read on my screen, but I did see that one one question came in. It says, for state of charge calculations, are there real-time energy losses applied evenly to charging and discharging? Oh, okay. Do the SOC calculations consider losses while the resource is neither charging nor discharging? Yeah, so the losses are actually applied in the charging portion of the equation. So losses would be included in the reg down portion of the equation, but the losses would not be applied to the reg up side of the equation. So that's a good question, though. Thanks for asking that. Operator, do we have any other questions on the phone right now?
Yes. Sergio, your line is open.
Great. Hey, Sergio.
Hi, Gabe. Thank you. Could you go back to that mu value table, the percentages by the hours? I think it's 30 on my deck, but yeah. Okay, perfect. So, my key question here, I guess, is how does this relate to the 50%?
Mm-hmm.
How can we better understand how this information indicates that 50% is adequate or not? And if not, how could it be tuned based on what information? Because we do understand that storage is fundamentally different from other assets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Storage does, because it is really an arbitrage product, it is bound by what it has done, and it is reasonable that there might need to be different rules or different notions to be created for this asset. But we'd like to better understand how this is being evidence-driven and focused on that. So I guess that's really my key question. Yeah.
Yeah, I frankly, I think that's a really good question, and I do appreciate that, CISA understands what the issue is, and you guys respect that, there may need to be different rules and different solutions in place for storage resources. I really do appreciate that. I don't know that this table necessarily answers the question that you're asking. From this chart, we're basically looking at a least squares approach to applying an appropriate value for what the impact of a reg up award or a reg down award is on state of charge. So what we'd say is our best guess at, let's just pick hour NIG1, if a resource gets awarded for reg down in hour NIG1, our best guess of how much energy is going to be charged up to that resource is 12%. It doesn't say what the 95th percentile of our range could potentially be. It doesn't say what the 5th percentile is, and I think you'd need to do some kind of estimation like that to discover what the upper and lower bounds are during any particular hour, and maybe you don't go all the way up to like 99th percentile or maybe not even the 97.5th percentile, but I think there would be some level, 90th percentile, 95th percentile of intervals that the ISO would want to make sure that we could potentially cover and say, look, if these resources 20% of the time or even 10% of the time might be charging up by 20 megawatts when they receive a 100 megawatt award for reg down, we'd want to be able to unload that resource at that same rate or have bids in the discharge direction at that same rate so that we're not running into this issue of the resource being fully charged in 20% of our NIG1s. Admittedly, we haven't done that analysis yet. Frankly, I'm not even sure that, we have a lot of data and a lot of instances where we're looking at overall awards for reg up and reg down and how that impacts state of charge. Obviously, we have 1/24th of that information roughly for each of the individual hours. And the data that we looked at here was just over the last few months. And if we do believe that these values change seasonally and we want to, frequently update this analysis, I'm not sure if the data is there to support, a real granular analysis of each of these hours developing these percentiles, because you may only have a few observations. Now, again, we haven't done the analysis yet, but that could be something that, we try to do in the next few iterations. I think our initial idea of saying, well, if you've got a 100 megawatt award for reg up, you need to have 100 megawatts of bids for energy in the downward direction to be able to charge the resource. I think we kind of looked at these numbers and said, well, that might be a little bit excessive because, looking at these numbers, we're probably not, dispatching the resources all the way at the top of their reg range for the full hour that we've got them on reg, either reg up or reg down. And almost certainly that's not the case for reg up because those numbers are much smaller than the numbers for reg down, even on the most extreme hours. So we probably don't need the resources to be bidding in 100%. But 50% might be a little bit more of a reasonable number, particularly for the reg down, because, if you look at the peak numbers here, like on hour ending 18, where on average, if you get a 100 megawatt award for regulation down, you'd expect to charge the resource by about 35 megawatts. If that's your typical number, yeah, I don't think 50% is out of the realm of possibilities on some of those extreme days that you're really, tapping into that reg down quite significantly. Could we potentially taper back the requirements for reg up? I think that's possible. Could we potentially, and I know in previous calls we've had conversations about, well, if you get a reg up and a reg down award, maybe you don't need as much energy bids because some of the reg up award and the reg down award are going to kind of offset each other. And I think there's something to be said for that too. Again, probably want to dig into some more of the data on that. But we thought 50% might be a good place to just start. Does that help at all, Sergio? I know that was a long answer.
I would say that does help. We understand that there might be limited data, but the fact that there's limited data sort of works both ways. It works both ways in the sense that first, it's harder to estimate the distribution of that data because you have few of it, but at the same time, it's hard to trust the central tendency of this data and admit that this might be an average. And also, if you compound that fact with that bar chart that Guillermo showed, that bar chart, despite the fact that obviously the lack of AGC, not following instructions, and not having SOC could all be interrelated, taking these two data points together, which are the only data points the ISO has offered us to justify this 50% requirement, it doesn't seem to indicate that, one, the problem is as frequent as the documents so far say, and two, that this requirement of 50% is in the adequate magnitude. So we do not contest that something here might need to be done, but as you can see in our comments submitted Friday, basically we do urge that either this is considered as an interim measure as we start incorporating more and more and updating that SOC formula. These are great first steps. I think acknowledging that this should be hourly values, maybe even doing monthly values as we go on would be even better. And then we'll have a better central measure of the tendency of this. But thank you, Gabe.
Yeah, and like I was trying to tee up at the beginning of the conversation, I do not think that this is the last chapter on this. Kind of what we're hearing from our operators today is that these circumstances can be very hard to manage at times. And just thinking about last week, this is not an extra complication that the operators want to have on top of their regular jobs, which can already be very challenging. And I know you talked a little bit about this before, Sergio, but maybe getting something implemented sooner, and then perhaps taking a little bit more time to think about a more refined approach, may also be something that the ISO would be open to, so that we could get something in place soon and hopefully prevent some of the near-term problems, but then long-term, really sit down and roll up our sleeves and do some, serious soul searching about when these rules are working and when they're not, and how we might be able to relax them during certain times.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for listening to us, Gabe. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, I really appreciate your comments and a lot of the other comments we're getting from stakeholders too on this. It's really good.
Hi, Gabe. This is Cam. Have Callie Wells in line.
Great. Thanks.
Hey, Gabe. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. I have a couple questions. I think it was on the last slide that you stopped on. So do you mind progressing back towards that? This one, yes. Okay, so I know you want us to hold off the discussion about ideally what should be proposed, and right now just understand what it is you're proposing. So I have a couple questions I want to make sure I understand. So the fourth sub-bullet on the first main bullet here where you say there will be no bidding requirement in the day-ahead market, so that's new in this presentation. The last paper had you guys were still proposing the bidding requirement in the day-ahead, correct?
Absolutely correct, yep.
Okay, so I appreciate that. I think that was one of the elements that we did not understand why that bidding requirement needed to be in the day-ahead market. Yep. But the sub-bullet above that one, where I guess it's a couple of them, where you talk about now it's going to be restricted to 8 megawatts of reg up and 8 megawatts of reg down, so it still has 4 megawatts to provide energy bids in the real time. Is this a new piece of the proposal?
No, this is the same.
It sounds.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is not the case today. So are you guys, what is it that you're proposing, I guess, now for the day-ahead market?
Yeah, this is the same proposal that we had in the paper, the last paper that we put out, and it would be the same rules in the real-time market and the day-ahead market.
Okay, so in the day-ahead market, you are proposing to restrict the amount of reg up and reg down a resource can provide, even after taking into account the MUSE and updated state of charge formula, they can actually provide that?
Correct.
Okay. I'll hold off our comments till the afternoon discussion. But that I appreciate you clarifying that, because I don't think that was clear before in the paper. So you are still proposing some change to the day-ahead market. It's just a constraint. So I'm assuming this will be a new constraint in the market?
Correct. That's right.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks for the questions. Good clarification there.
Okay, next question is from Susan Snyder.
Great.
Yeah. Hi, Gabe. Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I guess I'm a little confused about a couple things on this slide too. I'm also very confused about what the discussion you just had with Carrie, because I don't really understand, if you're requiring energy bids in the real-time market, why you would only allow up to 8 megawatts up and down. So that is not clear. And when you get to that point, if you could explain that better, I don't really get it. And I also don't get why, if you're having multipliers that you're using for these regulation awards, how you could award 12 megawatts of regulation up and 12 megawatts down. Wouldn't that be restricted by the multipliers?
So what we're talking about here is an upper limit on what the resources could receive for regulation awards. I think it is a little bit easier to think about in the real-time market, even though the awards happen in the day-ahead market, because it's basically the rule that we would be implementing is that in the real-time market, the resource has to have accompanying bids with the regulation award in the opposite direction. So let's actually go back up to the previous slide. Let me see if I can. Yeah. So if a resource receives an award for 100 megawatts of regulation up, we would require that resource in the real-time market to have energy bids of from 0 megawatts to negative 50 megawatts of regulation, not regulation, energy down. So essentially, what could potentially happen in the real-time market is that resource is providing reg down hour after hour, eventually the resource gets to a point where it's fully charged, and if there are no bids in the downward direction, sorry, I did that in the opposite way.
I think you're misunderstanding my question. I'm not questioning. I have a question about the energy bids, but that's not what I'm asking about.
Sure.
Okay. What I'm asking about, if you could go back to the slide you were on before,
Yep.
is that a 12 megawatt resource, a 12 megawatt resource could get an award of 12 megawatts of regulation up, but your formula has a multiplier in it that I thought would reduce the amount that it could get of regulation up, for example.
No, that's the formula governing state of charge. It's not any kind of a requirement on how much regulation the resource could provide.
Okay, but if the multiplier is applied to the state of charge, that would reduce the amount that they would be capable of being awarded, wouldn't it? Perhaps I'm not understanding this as deeply as I need to, but.
Yeah, the state of charge formula would impact, for example, it's like an intertemporal constraint. It's not a constraint during any particular hour. So if you had, 10 back-to-back-to-back intervals where you were providing reg up, your state of charge would be updating in the day-ahead market via that state of charge formula. And we'd say, okay, during this first hour, you've got 100 megawatt hours. The next hour, you've got 85 megawatt hours. The next hour, you've got 70 megawatt hours. Eventually, if the day-ahead market determined that your state of charge was insufficient to carry a regulation up award, you wouldn't be awarded the reg up award in the real-time market. This is talking about a new requirement, so a separate requirement that we're thinking about implementing that we proposed in the last paper. And the requirement would state that during any particular hour in the real-time market, we would want to have energy bids going alongside ancillary service bids. So you've got an award for a specific amount of regulation, reg up. You've got to have at least 50% of that award for an energy bid to charge the resource.
So what you're saying is, even though there's a state of charge multiplier, in theory, even with the state of charge multiplier, perhaps the resource in some hours could get a 12 megawatt of regulation up award because there would be sufficient state of charge to do it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm guessing I get that now. Now, why would they only be allowed to get if they get megawatt regulation up and regulation down somehow? Why is that less?
So the idea here is that, the rule would state that I need bids, energy bids, in the opposite direction of any regulation award that you give a resource during a particular.
But you don't need them in the day-ahead market. You only need them in the real-time market.
Correct. So in the real-time market, you wouldn't be able to give an award of 9 megawatts of regulation up and 9 megawatts of regulation down because the requirement would stipulate that you have 4.5 megawatts of bids in the upward direction and 4.5 megawatts of bids in the downward direction. 9 plus 4.5 is 13.5, which is bigger than the total capacity of this example resource.
Well, okay. I mean, I understand the simple math, but I guess what I don't understand is if you had 12 megawatts up, an award of 12 megawatts up and 12 megawatts down,
yep,
why you still could not offer bids in the real-time market. You're not offering. I don't really understand why you would have to reduce the award in order to allow for bids. Bids can happen. I mean, you have the day-ahead market; it's already closed. Why would you have to reduce the day-ahead market award to permit bids in the real-time market? You could, if they had full awards, 12 up and 12 down, presumably you could still offer bids in the real-time market. Could you? I guess maybe I'm missing something here.
I don't think so. So if a resource, let's just think about a traditional gas resource. If a gas resource, 100 megawatt gas resource, gets an award for 100 megawatts of regulation up, that resource can't then, and it's carried over to the real-time market. That resource then can't be dispatched for energy in addition to the regulation, because all of the capacity of the resource is providing the regulating service.
Right. Now that I understand, and you can't dispatch it, but you can have them. They could still bid into the real-time market, and you could decide whether you're going to dispatch. You're going to be using these energy bids to do a buyback, right? If it turns out to be necessary.
No. I'm talking about a resource having insufficient state of charge to provide a ancillary service, and that resource actually receiving an energy award, a feasible energy award, to bring it back to a point where it can continue to provide that ancillary service.
Okay, so the purpose of the bids is not for the buyback. The purpose of the bids is to restore the state of charge to what it needs to be in order to provide, to satisfy and comply with the regulation award.
Correct.
Okay, that I thank you. That is very helpful. I did not understand it that way, and okay. I'm still. I want to think some more about whether you actually have to limit the awards for that. But I appreciate the explanation, and I will give that some more thought. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Susan. And I like that language. I'm noting that down, and I'm hoping to be able to incorporate that and fold that into the next version of the paper, and hopefully that'll clear up other confusion as well.
Okay, yeah, and that I think that would be good to explain, because we just had a pretty extensive conversation, with this earlier slides about the whole issue of the buyback.
Right.
And so then this idea, okay. And I guess one more question. The idea of having to offer the energy awards or the energy bids, I think you and I had a little discussion at the regular stakeholder meeting about the must offer obligation for a storage resource that was being counted for flexible capacity and for regular RA.
Yep.
And the idea that there is a must offer, 24/7 must offer obligation, certainly in the day ahead market. But do they not also have to offer that in the real time market, or is that not part of the must offer obligation?
Yeah, and I think, and maybe this is still where we could be even clearer in the proposal. So the last bullet, the last sub bullet under the first bullet, so the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth sub bullet says, there's no new bidding requirements that we're talking about here in the day ahead market. You're absolutely, you still have, a flex RA award. You still have to bid in the day ahead market. So that is going to be a requirement.
Okay. And so now, do those resources that are being counted for NQC and ESC also have to offer those economic bids in the real-time market? Is that part of the must-offer obligation?
That's part of the must-offer.
Okay, so this is so when you say they have to offer these for half of the range or whatever it is, they actually have to still offer the full range, right? I mean, and almost all of these resources are going to be RA resources, and almost all of them are going to be counted for flexible capacity, most likely. So they have a real-time and a day-ahead must-offer obligation to offer bids for the full range, right?
Correct.
And economic bids for the full range.
Correct. That's right.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate the help with that. Thanks for explaining it.
Yeah.
Okay. Next up, we have David McMillan.
Hi. Thank you. It's David McMillan with Megawatt Storage. If you step back to your slide 30, the one that you were discussing with Sergio, the reg up and the reg down percentages are significantly different. So it looks like you're leaning heavily on reg down, which would mean that you're over procuring your energy and you need to adjust down. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And obviously you're leaning more on your regulation down services during particular hours than others as well.
But pretty consistently across the board.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm not sure there's any hour there where the reg down is smaller than the reg up.
Mm-hmm.
So my first reaction would be, I think the PERC or NERC standards say these are supposed to be balanced. So the first reaction is you should buy a little bit less energy so that these two percentages come out equal. But then I thought, well, maybe the higher reg down is because you're trying to somehow compensate for the charging efficiency of the storage. So my next question is, does this reg down percentage include the charging efficiency losses or not? Have you already taken that out?
So for the the values that are appearing in this figure, they do include the round trip efficiencies. So this is actual impacts on state of charge, and you would not have to apply an additional multiplier. Because, and the reason we did that is because the multipliers will vary from resource to resource.
All right. So one way to get things back in balance a bit would be just buy a little bit less energy. And if you're over procuring the energy because you're nervous about running out, if you have a bigger frequency regulation award on both sides, but it's equal amounts of reg up and reg down, you would then provide yourself with the buffer you need in the event that you've under procured the energy. I suspect that maybe one reason you're over procuring energy is because it might actually end up being cheaper to do that at some points. But okay, so if you move ahead 2 slides now to year 32, going back to this 8 and 4 business, from the previous discussion, I can understand why you might require that the previous interval to the regulation award have an energy component bid so that you can use that previous interval to get the SOC to the position you want going into the period where you've got the reg award. So I would understand that as a possible model, although I think it's cumbersome. But what I don't understand is this business of having the reg award and the energy award in the same interval. Because it would seem to me that if the asset simply bid 12 meg up and 12 meg down, that gives you essentially the same dispatch flexibility as this 8+4 thing.
Yeah.
What is the difference in expected dispatch with the 8+4 vis-a-vis a 12 and 12 reg?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues with 12 with awarding this example resource an award of 12 megawatts of reg up and 12 megawatts of reg down is exactly the issue that you point out. Well, the system tends to be leaning a little bit more on reg down. So if this happens hour after hour after hour, eventually what'll happen is this resource will be completely charged, full state of charge, and won't be able to provide the reg down anymore until the reg up discharges the resource sufficiently that it can provide the reg down. I think what I heard you say was, while you potentially require energy bids the interval before the resources awarded regulation bids, but what we're seeing with a lot of the schedules for storage resources is that they get awarded, the reg award in one direction or the other the entire 24 hours of the day. So I think in that case, the requirement that you might be suggesting would effectively be the same thing as what I'm proposing, is that, even if you were asking, say, hey, make sure you give me an energy award to kind of set me up to go into the hour, so my state of charge is sufficient. If you've got an award every hour and you're always doing that, effectively what you're doing is bidding regulation and bidding energy. And I think the reason why we want the reg and the energy bids in the same hour and the availability of the energy bids in the same hour is to ensure that if you are in one particular 5-minute interval and you have to submit your bids 65 minutes prior to the start of an hour, 75 minutes prior to the start of the hour, so you really have to know pretty far in advance. If you actually do run out of state of charge, you've got the bids there, and that can charge the resource or potentially discharge the resource, whatever's needed to make sure it can continue to provide the regulating service that it was awarded for.
So the thing I'm still confused about, though, is if the operator just had the KISO operator in the real time had 12 meg up and 12 meg down of reg, he is perfectly free to use that to explicitly move the state of charge to where he wants it. So, separating this into reg and energy seems to be a needless complication. If he says, oh, the state of charge of that that storage is too charged up. I would really be happier with having a lower SOC, but I've got 12 meg up and 12 meg down as flexibility. I'm just going to issue a dispatch to it to move the SOC down to a place where I'm more comfortable with it. Particularly if, as you say, these resources are typically getting awarded an entire day's worth of reg, if they just bid the full 12 meg up and 12 meg down all day, then the operator could use that to dynamically adjust the SOC to wherever he wanted.
So you're thinking about using exceptional dispatch to move charge the resource up or discharge the resource in one 5-minute interval?
I'm saying use the freedom you have under the 4-second signal to actively manage the SOC so that the fleet is optimally poised to handle any problems. It's no different really than the discharge you would be using with this energy regulation thing. It's just a lot cleaner, where you've just got full flexibility to adjust every 4 seconds to maintain the SOC exactly where you want. It just changes maybe a little bit the algorithm of how you dispatch the regulation. It realizes that SOC is an important target to be keeping an eye on in addition to frequency. So you might actually be shifting energy from one storage resource to the other to make both of their SOCs line up to where you want, or or you might be buying additional energy so that you can move the SOC of a storage. But it greatly simplifies it, both, it would seem, for the operator and for the storage fleet, if they can just bid regulation and let the operator do the adjustments that he needs to actively manage the SOC every 4 seconds.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't totally agree with you there. Take this to the extreme. Let's suppose you just had, one storage resource, and that was the only resource that was providing regulation across the entire market. And that one resource was completely charged. And you want the system, your AGC every 4 seconds is telling the system, hey, we need reg down, we need reg down. How would you couldn't charge that you couldn't discharge that resource on a 4-second basis using AGC instructions, because the AGC is pulling the resource in the opposite direction.
You send a different AGC signal to every resource, right?
Yeah.
It's not one signal going out to everybody.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. You've got an entire fleet of storage resources. All the resources are providing regulation. If the whole fleet is fully charged, because it's been providing this reg down service all day, there's no way to kind of say, yeah, I'm going to back down the entire fleet, because you're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul here.
All right, and how would the split regulation energy dispatch result in anything any different?
Yeah, so the energy...
If you have the problem, in other words, if you have the problem you just hypothesized, how does having this split thing make it any different?
So you've got some of the capacity for the storage resource available for energy dispatch. So we're not talking about 4-second AGC dispatch. We're talking about 5-minute energy award dispatch. And you can actually issue with the additional headroom. So the resource is not fully encumbered by AS awards. So the entire capacity of the resource is not devoted to providing ancillary services. You've got a little bit of room to actually issue 5-minute instructions to storage resources to either charge or discharge. So you could simply issue it an award for energy in the 5-minute real-time market and say, go ahead and discharge.
This feels a lot like the shell game that some street vendors play, where there's a marble under the cups and they're moving it around. Because I think under the hypothesis that you set up in your hypothetical, you assume that you had to buy all the available regulation in order to meet the grid needs. And now you're assuming that you could cut back one of those regulation sources to 2/3 of what it provided. You're going to have to make up that 1/3 deficiency somewhere else so that you can apply the energy adjustment to the resource that you cut back. But I think if you net out the whole thing, it's just a shell game of sort of moving the problem around.
Yeah, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that either. We're not changing the requirements for regulation, so we're still going to procure just as many megawatts of regulating capacity up and megawatts of regulating capacity down. So those targets don't change.
Well, you're just changing it on an individual resource level.
Yes.
The other impact I think that could come back and bite here is if you, like, regulation is an important income source for storage. If you cut back the amount of regulation storage can sell to 2/3, you're probably going to see a pricing impact on that.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, we anticipate that.
Actually, a couple quick questions on the earlier slides that were presented. Were those SOC graphs that we looked at earlier, were those actual SOC or those estimated SOCs?
The graph that Guillermo presented with 3 different lines on it?
Yeah, like the ones like the distributions and so forth that show the deviations by, the amount of deviation relative to the SOC, like I think it would be your slide 23 or 24.
Let's see if I can up here.
Forward one. Is that actual SOC or is that your estimate of the SOC?
Yeah, this is actual SOC, and I think we're comparing day ahead in real time.
Okay, and go ahead 2 slides. My naive interpretation of what you're seeing here is an act of effort by the storage to not get fully charged or fully depleted, possibly because for a lot of storage that stresses the storage more than staying in a narrow range.
Yeah, I think that's possible.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
I don't see any questions in the queue.
Thanks, Keone. I did see one question pop up in chat from Bo Liu, and then I'll read this, and then I do want to get to Alva's presentation here. So Bo asked, how often will CAISO update those hourly multipliers? Will the CAISO plan to publish those multipliers to market stakeholders? I think the answer is we would certainly be publishing those values. That would likely, and I think we talked about this in the paper a little bit, that would likely be something that would go into our business practice manual, so they can be referenced by anybody. And I think we'd also have, include in that business practice manual sort of a robust method of how we're actually coming up with those calculations. And I believe, and I don't recall right off the top of my head, but we were looking at 3 or 4 months of data, basically from the spring of this year, to calculate those values that we have published in the paper and I put in the slide deck. We would likely be reviewing this at least quarterly because we do anticipate that our needs and our use of regulation would change from quarter to quarter. So we'd probably also spell out how we would want to do that in the BPM. But that's a great. So, operator, maybe we could see if we've got Alva on the line here, and then I think maybe pull up his slide deck as well.
Okay, before we do move on, there's Eleanor Reeves on the line for a question.
Sure. Why don't we take that one question, and then we'll move on.
Hi, Gabe. Ellie Reyes here at Calpine. Hey, quick question on your conversation with Mr. McMillan. I think I heard you mention that, on that hypothetical case, there's a bid on the same resource for the opposite direction, and then there is that available capacity that could be dispatched in the 5 minutes. Just to clarify, if that same resource is already being controlled by CAISO on regulation, which means that the AGC optimization takes over and not what I call ADS dispatch on the 5-minute level.
Yeah.
Are you intending to make a switch while it was on regulation?
No. So, okay. All right. let's back it up a little bit. Let's think about not a storage resource where it's a little bit more complicated, but maybe just a traditional gas resource. So you could have a gas resource that has 50 megawatts of energy bids and an award for 50 megawatts of regulation. So that gas resource can receive energy awards every 5 minutes, anywhere from 0 megawatts up to 50 megawatts. And then every 4 seconds, in addition to that energy award, it could receive an additional 50 megawatts to the set point, which would be controlled by the AGC. And that 4 seconds would sort of be deviating from the baseline of the energy award that the resource got in the 5-minute real-time energy market.
Yeah, but are you suggesting that while CAISO is controlling it for regulation, that 5-minute dispatch is to be taken into consideration in that 4-second set point on regulation?
Yeah, it already is today for all resources.
So you're saying that the embedded calculation is going to be changed in the EMS or in AGC itself, not necessarily on the economic dispatch?
No.
Because once you're on regulation, you're not really following the 5-minute dispatch anymore. You're following the 4-second.
Correct. Nothing would change with the way that AGC and set points work today. It would just be that the storage resources, in effect, would be able to provide a little bit less regulation. They would be required to have some energy bids in the market, and on a 5-minute to 5-minute basis, they could get dispatched for energy as well as, following AGC signals, and that's the exact same way it works today.
Yeah, that's not necessarily clear to me, but we can move on. I'll probably have to talk a little bit more. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I saw Alva's presentation up there briefly. Let's see if we can get it back up. Let's see if we've got Alva on the phone.
I'm here. Thank you.
Back with us. That's terrific.
I'll try to go through these quickly. There's a very vigorous discussion there, and some of the subjects were things that we were brought up in passing in the slides. I wanted to say these slides have not been fully socialized at PG&E, and that's the reason I'm presenting these as my own opinions. We have comments that are similar to these submitted, but I wanted to be careful to not claim these as the position of the company, and also make sure that I avoid presenting any information specific to our bidding process. Essentially, we're going to go over one more time these two proposed changes, and therefore I'll try to make it quick. We had a couple of observations about pitfalls, perhaps, or refinements that might be called for in them. So we can go to the next slide. Unless I have control of the slides, I don't think I do. Great, thank you. So we wanted to just essentially talk about our experience with regard to the concept of the regulation SOC buffer energy bid requirement, as well as to the state of charge calculation, including regulation energy, and then sort of along the lines of what David was bringing up. I think ultimately, there are some underlying issues. I don't think they can be addressed in the time frame that we're talking about, and I think we have to be careful not to try to hamper this effort, which is really important in order to get to those potentially longer-term solutions. So if we can go to the next slide. So we've actually seen in our experience quite frequently the skirting of or even the hitting of limits on state of charge in the way that regulation is used. And so we are in agreement that really the only way to get out of that situation right now in real time is to have some ability to dispatch in the opposite direction. I think one thing I wanted to point out is our understanding of the way regulation works, and this gets to the whole discussion of the regulation award versus the energy bid, is a regulation award causes that portion of the bid curve essentially to be pulled out and to become invisible to the ADS, the dispatch system. And that means it's not available to the economic dispatch of the system to essentially dispatch the unit to a different set point and cause charge or discharge relative to where it is. And so there has to be an energy bid in order, an actual energy bid in the market system in order to be able to do that. However, and this is where our realization that both changes were really going to be called for. Even if the bids are available, it's entirely possible that the dispatch will not be feasible in terms of restoring the SOC, because if as Gabe pointed out, if the regulation signal is going in only one direction, then even a dispatch award in the opposite direction may not actually do anything to restore or change the SOC at that point. It may cause the SOC to sort of flatline, but unless you have enough of an energy bid buffer to cover essentially a worst case take, the SOC may not move in real time. And we've seen situations where essentially we're receiving discharge awards, large discharge awards every 5 minutes for an hour or more, and the SOC is not changed because at the same time that discharge award is being received, the regulation is continuing to be used at the same magnitude in the opposite direction. So that's one issue. Another issue that's got to be addressed here, and this was the real reason we brought up the day ahead versus real time issue, was that it's important that the market algorithm, when it takes a regulation, when it provides a regulation award, it needs to reserve the energy in the opposite direction. It can't award the energy in the opposite direction day ahead. It has to reserve it. There has to be the solution has to include that buffer. And similarly, in real time, the bid, in some sense, the energy bid in the opposite direction has to, if possible, be reserved, because if it is being taken and then there's still a need for additional energy, you potentially have you're in the same position you were. So there's and I'm not sure exactly how much control there has to be over the energy dispatch of those bids in real time in order to preserve that capability, but it is a concern because the fact that a bid is in the energy market means it can be taken purely because of the market algorithm, which may have nothing to do with what's going on in the SOC of the battery. And then my last point is the one that I was just making, which is that even when energy bids are dispatched to preserve SOC, it may be that dispatch is ineffective. And so that basically means that I think there's something of a need potentially in real time to look at a worst case rather than an average behavior in deciding how much of a constraint you're going to put on the SOC management in real time. So we can go to the next slide. Actually, I can stop there if anybody has a question at this point. Okay, if not, I'll just continue. So we go to the next slide. So on the issue of state of charge calculation, including regulation energy, I believe that the effect of these percentage parameters is going to be different day ahead and real time. The basic, in the day ahead market, the effect of having these percentage parameters is basically going to be to yield a more robust solution overall. And the fact that the battery is being dispatched over the course of the day means that it's not that important that it be accurate in particular hours, because the effects of these parameters are cumulative. So as long as you're sort of controlling and restricting the amount of the degree to which you're hitting state of charge constraints day ahead, you will have a more robust solution overall in the day ahead market. In real time, these parameters have a different function because basically they are going to be interacting with the actual regulation that is happening in a particular hour. And our observation is that regulation within an hour is often very biased. It may, somebody was making the assertion earlier that regulation is taken in fairly balanced way up and down within an hour. We have observed many situations where that's not the case. And so if you essentially are assuming a balanced, applying the percentages to your awards in both directions, you can essentially have a result that is either inadequate or even counter to the direction that you actually want to manage the state of charge. So this is a concern, and I still think the solution that's being proposed by the CAISO has to be an improvement over what currently exists, but I think it's worth thinking about potentially, at least within the binding hour, looking at state of charge more in worst case terms rather than average terms. So essentially, based on where the state of charge of a battery is at the beginning of an hour, you know which of the constraints is going to be hit, and you can use a parameter in the optimization of state of charge, which is used in the energy awards. You can use a percentage which is potentially much higher in the direction that you have that you're at risk of hitting. So that would be a potential dynamic change within the dispatch algorithm that could be considered. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So we basically wanted to confirm that we agree with the CAISO that both of these changes are needed and that they need to work in combination. And just simply to point out that there is a danger of them working not in combination. So to the degree that that can be avoided, these manual steps that have been taken in the market recently to take units out of regulation altogether would be helpful. So this is just repetition of what I said in the previous slide. We can go to the next slide. So the only things that we wanted to suggest as enhancements is, and I think we've already heard that the unencumbered energy bids be available in real time to address SOC issues. We suggest possibly managing SOC within individual intervals based on worst case adverse takes rather than based on long-term averages. And that doesn't necessarily mean 100% take. It could mean some sort of 95% confidence interval take, but without accounting for what's actually happening at the battery, which is actually being measured through the telemetry and then being approximated for future intervals, these parameters could yield bad results. The other thing which we're not clear about what's happening when regulation awards are reduced, and we do think that there should be the CAISO's objective should not be to take a battery off of AGC altogether when it hits a storage limit. If possible, the AGC award in the offending direction should be reduced to zero, but not the AGC in the non-offending direction. And we've seen instances where the battery has to be taken off of AGC altogether, which is a much larger hit, and it's not really necessary either for CAISO or for us that step be taken. The other idea, which certainly cannot be implemented in this time frame, but it is that we perhaps need to start thinking about, or CAISO needs to start thinking about, as we do already, about SOC and regulation energy as quantities that should be forecast in the same way that we forecast solar, generation. There are stochastic elements to the forecast. There's an underlying model, and it should really be possible to look at this as a forecasting problem and get a more dynamic solution to the problem over time. This is, of course, is not in scope for this initiative. And then we can go to, I think, the last slide. So, so the last thing I wanted to bring up is, we, in some ways, we agree with, or I agree with the points that were being made by David, that regulation should function differently. It cannot function differently right now, and so I don't agree with any of his ideas being potentially being applied within the existing regulation algorithms. That's a big job, changing regulation algorithms. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that it is possible to change regulation algorithms. It was pointed out to me, and when we were looking at these slides internally, that PJM has two different kinds of regulation, and one kind is fast. It's called fast, and the other kind's called slow. I mean, it's an arbitrary, division of regulating resources. But what happens then is that the fast resources are returned to their set point by deployment of the slow resources. And so simply by separating out the uses of different regulating resources, essentially what David was talking about, sending different signals to different resources, it has been possible in other ISOs to resolve this problem to some extent. I don't agree with the idea that an operator can step in and use regulation as a kind of dispatch algorithm. So I don't think that's the right direction, but it's clear that there are other forms of regulation algorithms that could potentially address this. It's also possible, and maybe we'll see as this gets deployed, but also as the flexible ramping product gets more realistic in terms of being able to actually procure a real flexible ramping product in real time, that may also be potentially usable to manage the regulation capability of batteries. So that's another thought, is that the uncertainty in whether the availability of the regulation could be incorporated by requiring flexible ramping from the system as a whole. And then finally, in the longer term, the trends that have been pointed out in the data today look to us as being closely related to resources that are not under the CAISO control. So I don't think the issue is, and I think David seemed to be suggesting that the CAISO was overbuying energy. I think the more likely situation is that solar is doing what it does, and the ramping of the system is essentially not under the control of CAISO, or it's under limited control, and so they're having to rely on the other resource set that's available in the middle of the day, namely storage, to address the regulation problem. It's clear that if you required regulation from solar, you could potentially resolve that problem much more cheaply than it's being addressed currently. Another thing that needs to be kept in mind by people who are looking at the costs of regulation down, they're already high, but they may even be higher than you think because of the amount of BCR that may have to be paid out because even though imbalance energy is not part of the dispatch, it has to get paid at something like the bid price that has been put in by the battery. So we may have an incorrect underestimate of how costly uneconomic regulation down is. So those are my points, and I'm happy if those inspire any questions or disagreements. Happy to be part of the discussion. Thank you. Just checking. You actually were able to hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We were. Good job, Alva. I'm just wondering. I'm not hearing him. He might be double muted.
Gabe looks like he's muted.
Gabe, are you on?
Do we have any questions on the call?
Sergio, your line is open.
Yeah, thank you. This is Sergio Dueñas with Sept. More than a question, I think I'd like to echo the importance of trying to understand how these two proposals work together and what might be some of their limitations. I also really appreciate Alva bringing up imbalance reserves. That is a product that is really, I think it's really poised to mitigate a lot of the uncertainty that occurs, intra-hour or uncertainty that is unlikely to be able to be captured by other products in the prior markets even. So it would be valuable as well to try to frame this conversation. Perhaps it's a bit difficult to do so since the DAME initiative has been a bit more on hold, but I think it'll be restarting soon. But particularly in DAME, to also try to think about how this interplays with imbalance reserves. So really appreciate that point because it seems like we're trying to solve this a bit more in isolation, while issues like in DAME and EDAM are being viewed much more cohesively. So it would be good to try to do that too. But really appreciate your point, Salva. Yeah, thank you.
I saw a comment from David on my claim about whether solar is the issue. I'm sure it's not all of the issue, but I will point out if you look at the percentages, they're much higher during the solar hours. So, those are also the hours tend to be the hours where the prices are highest for regulation down. So I think market participants see the highest opportunity cost in those hours as well. But it's a hypothesis, so I think we would be better off turning to Guillermo to adjudicate between us and see who's actually or what is actually the source of that imbalance.
Any other questions?
There was one in the chat by David McMillan. David, do you want to ask that, or do you want me to read it?
I think Alva just addressed that.
Okay. I don't see any others.
Well, Alva, thank you so much for that presentation. I think there's a lot of really good information there, and I obviously appreciate that there's a lot of alignment between, sort of where you're at right now and what you're thinking about and sort of what the ISO has proposed. I believe, and we might want to switch back to our slide deck. I think what I've done, oh, thanks, great. I think what I've done is just allowed for some time and a placeholder slide here to open it up to discussion about where we think we need to go from here with the current proposal that we have, keeping in mind, and I think there's other really great points out there. There are things that we're addressing related to storage in the day-ahead market enhancements initiative. So that's the DAME initiative with regard to imbalance reserves and the imbalance reserve up and the imbalance reserve down product we're thinking about there. There's obviously plenty of discussion about how things are going to be priced, and I think there's going to be a lot of focus on storage resources in the price formation initiative, which is coming up, which has begun, and those conversations have started. And kind of, what we've got here, and then sort of what we're thinking about in terms of, our next steps in the storage modeling enhancements initiative, which we're planning to kick off quite soon as well, with kind of, the proposals that we have here are sort of a first start, and that's kind of our first pass at some rules that we think could help us with some of the problems that Guillermo outlined. And then I think, obviously the ISO is committed to continuing to update and refresh this data and continue to deliver it and dig deeper into some of the cases where we have seen some trouble in the past. So with that, do we have any hands up in the queue? Is there anybody else out there who wants to make some comments on where they'd like to see us go with this proposal?
Callie Wells.
Hey, Gabe, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Actually, at this point, I think I've also heard it brought up a couple times or questions. There's a lot of constraints currently in the market in both the day-ahead and the real-time related to regulation and state of charge, and there's a lot of proposed changes. I think, honestly, what would be extremely useful is some numerical examples. I know we put that in our comments. If there's any way you can show us through examples how it works today and all the different constraints. So I think there's 2 in the day ahead, 2, maybe 3 in the real time that have to do with regulation and state of charge for storage resources. And then show us the proposed changes and what effect that will have so that we can make sure, 1, we understand what the outcome is going to be on storage resources, but 2, make sure that what the outcome is going to be aligns with what you guys the issues you guys are trying to address, because I forget which caller brought it up, asking about whether or not you actually need the energy bids in the interval prior to the regulation award. That's an interesting question because I know the state of charge constraints are lagged. And so it's hard for me to think through that on the fly right now, I'm sure, and I don't want to put you on the spot to think through it either on the fly. So if you can walk through some numerical examples, I think that would go a long way in getting everyone to kind of understand what's going to change, what the outcome will be, and then we can determine if that does align with addressing the issues. I would like to see that as the next step.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Callie. I appreciate it.
And we have Alva.
Yeah, I just want, on that question of the lag, I did want to point out, I think Gabe actually made it clear, but in real time, every 5 minutes, you need to essentially have that bid available to address what's happened in the previous 5 minutes. So you can't have a situation where you only require the bid in the previous hour, because as you go through the hour, you have to have the bids in that hour capable of addressing this issue. I mean, I think the issue of the lag could be an important one in terms of the effect it has on the solution. But I think as a bidding requirement, you still need to have it available and in the same hour as the regulation is being provided.
We have David back in line.
Great.
So just briefly, I sent this as a comment to the presenters, but I'll throw it open for wider input given the comment to back. I suggested that CAISO provide a description of what the overall grid sees as net energy and what a specific storage project sees as dispatch instructions. And the dispatch would be both the energy and the 4-second reg signal and the reg award. And do that under both the plus and minus 12 meg reg award model and also the plus and minus 8 meg reg and the 4 meg energy model in order to be able to look at the difference both from the standpoint of the storage project and the standpoint of the overall grid's total energy availability each 4 seconds. I think that'll help bring a lot of illumination to the dynamics that are occurring here, including the comment just made on, the difference between the 5-minute energy awards and the ancillary service award.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks for that comment. Appreciate it.
And that's all we have in the queue.
Okay, maybe let me just see here. I think this is all we've got. I may have one slide here. So let's go advance to the next slide, please. Frankly, I think we've talked about this, and I appreciate the dialogue. But we are thinking about how we could potentially relax the constraints that we've been talking about in certain hours. So I don't think we need to rehash that. I think there's other things we could potentially do to check to make sure we need the bids in the real-time market as opposed to not. But we may not know until the real-time market. And frankly, I think we've had this conversation as well. So I think we've really hit on a lot of the items that I wanted to cover. Before we wrap up, I might just make one more call just to see if there's any more comments or concerns out there. And I would just state one more time, I really do appreciate everybody taking the time today. I know last week was a super busy week, and we just had comments due on this. But just based on the schedule for where we're at right now with this initiative, we did want to have this conversation to try to bring together some of the loose ends and to get the data analysis, or at least the preliminary data analysis, out as quickly as we could, which will be followed up with more data analysis. Okay, so any final comments or thoughts, Keone?
I don't see any.
Okay.
I had one last question. This is actually unrelated to our slides, but one thing that I was curious about is in the exceptional dispatch section where you talk about exceptional dispatch to a state of charge, which I believe is in the scope for this initiative.
It is, yeah.
What is your concept of what happens to that to regulation awards in that case? Do you, if somebody is, because we actually last week received exceptional dispatches while we were providing regulation that essentially prevented us from discharging actually in a period where we would have wanted to discharge. And so the CAISO was trying to do exactly what this exceptional dispatch to a state of charge would do, except that if you provide an exceptional dispatch to an SOC, the question is, what does the market participant need to do to satisfy that? Would you expect us to essentially indicate that we're no longer available for regulation? What do you think would be the consequences in terms of actual behavior by market participants responding to such an exceptional dispatch?
Yeah, I may not be the best person to answer that question. I'm not sure if we've got anybody else on our side who wants to take a stab at it. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that, Alba.
Just something to take back then. I think, I mean, if it took the form of an SOC constraint, like the minimum state of charge constraint, that could be dealt with without having to do anything on either side in a sense. But once you actually say, we want you to hold a state of charge, it has a different, we're not clear about what the meaning of that is at this point. So.
Yeah, and frankly, I think that's a good point. I think, I've heard some other comments from others who are operating storage over the last few days and have also been a little bit frustrated about how, the compensation is working during exact situations like that when it's sort of a time when we need the storage resources to hold state of charge or attain a certain state of charge, and prices are really high. So I do hope that the exceptional dispatch, and I think it will. I think the rules that we have around what we're proposing for the exceptional dispatch to hold state of charge would provide that compensation where you'd receive, any opportunity cost if you couldn't provide energy during those intervals when prices were really high and you had to discharge later in the day when prices were lower. I think to answer your second question about how those exceptional dispatches are going to look on the resources end, I think they're going to be very similar to what the EDs look like today, where storage resources are basically going to be seeing, 0 megawatt, 0 megawatt, 0 megawatt, 0 megawatt as a maximum that they could generate at, because we want to hold state of charge. Whereas on the operator side, they'll actually have a tool that says, well, we know we want this resource at 120 megawatt hours. So as long as that 120 megawatt hour threshold, or whatever the threshold is being met, that our dispatch just kind of sends that same signal out to the resource.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Gabe. I think I think you do need to address the possibility that as has happened to us, a battery gets taken off of regulation because of the exceptional dispatch. I don't know if there's a compensation mechanism in place now for that. So
we haven't outlined that. I think that might be some, a place where we could spill a little bit more ink.
Yeah. Thank you.
So
we have.
Oh, go ahead.
Hey, Gabe, it's Mike McGuffin from CES. Just curious, there's not a whole lot of information out there on the actual logic in EMS that drives the regulation dispatch. And I think it's been about a decade since we've been asking for more information on the underlying logic, and we've had discussions with Sirajul. But are you aware of any logic within the regulation dispatch that accounts for different SOC levels for storage? If you've got a fleet of 10 storage resources that comprise the regulation fleet in a given hour, is there any adjustment or preference set for resources that are in a better SOC position than other resources within the fleet in that given hour?
Yeah, so we do have the regulation energy management resources, or the REM resources, that just provide regulation and not energy, and they have special EMS logic that applies to them. But if you take those resources and you set them aside and you're not talking about REM resources, the answer is effectively no. We're looking at storage resources just like we look at all resources when we're thinking about EMS. And you're going to the right person. Sirajul is our subject matter expert on ancillary services, and he wrote the book, so to speak, on how that logic works, and he'd be the best person to explain the details and the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah, if you could publish that book, that would be incredibly helpful.
I think it's a challenging book. I can look internally and see what kind of appetite there is for that. But I know there's a lot of nuance there.
Well, it's just like what the optimization across cells that are required within the batteries themselves. I mean, you may have cells that are at 100%, others that are 70. That SOC is an aggregate number, but it may not be reflective of where a battery can actually respond. It's similar. I think something similar can be done within the regulation dispatch logic to lean on resources that are in a better state at any given time, and that may help to retain SOC, for resources that may be in a place where it's not optimal. So I don't know if that's something that could be done, but I think that could potentially help the situation overall, and that's something that wouldn't require a market solution.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting idea, and I'll take that back and talk to our AS experts about it. Thanks, Mike.
Yep, thank you.
So, event producer, can you advance a couple slides? Next one, there you go. So the next step is for us to be discussing this at the Market Surveillance Committee on September 19th, where they'll provide an opinion for the policy. And then it'll go to the Board of Governors in October. I was wondering, I know Callie Wells, you had a question about another iteration of the final proposal, or will we hold another workshop related to that? I don't believe that's going to be the case, right, Gabe?
We might. I don't think we've ruled that out yet.
Okay. So that's still to be considered. Any other questions? If not, I want to thank those who have submitted comments. I think we got about 12 or more comments. I know it was a busy week last week. So thanks again for taking the time to do that. I know it's a lot of work. And I think the last slide we have next, if you move to the next slide, is just a reminder about our stakeholder symposium that's coming up. Please register for that. And with that, thanks again for all of your time. And you guys have a good rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.